Welcome, wanderers of the deep. Tonight, we set sail into waters that have swallowed more than ships. They've devoured truth itself. For centuries, the ocean has been our mirror and our graveyard. It reflects the beauty of our ambition and hides the bones of our mistakes. This is not a story of storms or pirates, nor of treasure buried beneath waves. This is a story of the cursed ships, vessels that vanished without reason, leaving only whispers, wreckage, and dread. Each of these ships carried more than cargo. They carried secrets, mutinies, experiments, forbidden relics, and the sins of their captains. And when the sea decided to collect its debt, no one returned to tell the tale. So take a deep breath, listen to the waves, and remember, when the sea calls your name, it always expects an answer.
The sea has many languages. Some whisper through waves, others roar through storms. But there are a few that speak only in silence, the kind that drifts across an empty horizon where a ship sails with full sails and no one left to steer her. That silence is where the story of the Mary Celeste begins. It was December 4th, 1872. The Atlantic was calm, its surface dull silver beneath the winter sun. Captain David Morehouse of the British brig De Gratia was standing on deck when his first mate pointed toward a faint shape on the horizon. Through the spyglass, Morehouse saw what looked like a merchant vessel, listing slightly to one side, her sails set but ragged. The sea around her was still, but something about the scene felt wrong. There was no signal flag, no visible crew, and no movement, only the steady roll of the ship on open water. As the De Gratia drew closer, they saw her name painted across the stern, Mary Celeste, Port of New York. She was a familiar name. Morehouse had even shared a meal with her captain, Benjamin Briggs, in New York a few weeks earlier. Briggs was a man of faith, calm and methodical, the sort of sailor who believed in order, even in chaos. He was sailing the Mary Celeste from New York to Genoa, carrying 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. But now, the ship that had left harbor strong and proud drifted like a corpse on the sea. When the boarding party climbed aboard, they were met not by wreckage or violence, but by absence. The deck was wet, but undamaged. The rigging was intact. Below, the cabins looked as though the crew had stepped away for only a moment. The galley still had food unspoiled. A sewing machine stood open, half-mended cloth beside it. A child's doll lay near the captain's bunk, his 2-year-old daughter's. And yet, there was no sign of life. The lifeboat was gone. So were the ship's papers, save for the logbook, whose last entry was dated November 25th, 1872, 10 days before the ship was found. It placed them at coordinates 35 degrees 8 minutes north, 17 degrees 15 minutes west, between the Azores and Portugal. The entry ended simply, "At noon, everything in order." Everything in order. Those 3 words would become one of the great riddles in maritime history. There was no struggle, no blood, no broken furniture or smashed cargo. The ship was seaworthy. Her cargo was almost entirely untouched. Only 9 barrels, out of more than 1,700, had leaked. Their wooden staves warped and cracked. The odor of raw alcohol filled the hold, sharp and metallic. The De Gratia crew sailed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar for salvage. When they arrived, the British Vice Admiralty Court convened a formal inquiry. It was here that the strange story turned into legend.
The court's Attorney General, Frederick Solly Flood, believed there must have been foul play. He suspected a conspiracy, that Captain Morehouse and Briggs had planned an elaborate insurance fraud. But the evidence said otherwise. Briggs's reputation was spotless. His crew had no known disputes and no valuables were missing. Still, rumors spread like wildfire. Newspapers called it a ghost ship. Pamphlets claimed the crew had been abducted by sea monsters or fled in panic from an exploding cargo. Spiritualists held seances, claiming to hear the voices of the lost. But for every wild theory, a rational question remained unanswered. Why would an experienced captain abandon a perfectly good ship in calm weather? One clue lay in the alcohol itself. Industrial alcohol, unlike drinking spirits, can release explosive vapors. If a few barrels leaked, the hold could have filled with invisible fumes. One spark, even from friction, could ignite the entire ship. Perhaps Captain Briggs, smelling the vapor, ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a precaution. But what if the rope holding the boat had snapped? In a moment of fear and caution, the crew may have sealed their own fate. The lifeboat hypothesis remains the most widely accepted, but it cannot explain everything. Briggs was cautious. He would not have abandoned ship unless he truly believed it was about to explode. Yet the Mary Celeste bore no scorch marks, no sign of fire, and the hatches were open, suggesting they had been aired deliberately. Perhaps a sudden squall scattered the small lifeboat. Perhaps a faulty barometer convinced Briggs that a storm was coming, and he made a decision that would cost them all. There is also the theory of human error mixed with fear. The ship's chronometer and sextant were missing, vital instruments for navigation. If Briggs believed his vessel was drifting toward dangerous reefs, he may have tried to reach the Azores Islands by lifeboat. A desperate move, but not impossible. If that was his choice, then he gambled against the Atlantic, and the Atlantic won. After the inquiry, the Mary Celeste was released back into commercial service, but her reputation never recovered. Sailors whispered that she was cursed, that the spirits of her lost crew haunted her decks. Captains who sailed her reported strange occurrences, tools vanishing, ropes snapping for no reason, sudden feelings of dread. One captain wrote in his journal, "There is something in the timbers. It listens." Whether superstition or simply bad luck, the ship seemed followed by misfortune. She changed hands repeatedly, each owner suffering ruin or disaster. Finally, in 1885, her last captain deliberately ran her aground near Haiti in a failed insurance scam. The ship broke apart on the reefs, and the Mary Celeste disappeared beneath the surf. No bodies were ever found, no trace of the crew, the Briggs family, or the lifeboat was ever recovered. Only the legend remained. In 2001, marine archaeologists from Canada examined the surviving documentation and compared it with oceanographic records. Their conclusion was practical, not paranormal. The Mary Celeste was a victim of circumstance, an experienced captain's cautious judgment undone by a chain of small, invisible mistakes. A leaking cargo, a fear of explosion, a sudden gust of wind, a line that snapped in the night. And yet, the story endures because it represents more than a mystery. It captures the fragility of order in an unforgiving world. A single decision, to stay or to flee, separates life from legend. The Mary Celeste has become a symbol of the unknown that still hides within the known. Even today, over 150 years later, sailors still glance at the horizon and think of her. A vessel without a crew. a ship adrift between reason and fear. Proof that the sea, no matter how well we chart it, remains a place where logic is only a guest. The Atlantic eventually swallows every story it carries, but not this one. Because the Mary Celeste never truly vanished. She simply became part of the ocean's memory, eternal, silent, and waiting. The ocean remembers every rebellion, every order shouted through wind and rain, every man who turned his back on his captain, every ship that sailed into paradise and never truly returned. Among them all, one name endures: HMS Bounty. To many, it's a story of mutiny. But to the men who lived it, it was something far darker. A collision between duty and desire, between the law of the crown and the freedom of the sea. It began as a voyage of science and ended as a legend of betrayal. In the late 18th century, the British Empire stretched like a net across the globe. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean were booming, and with them the need for cheap food for enslaved laborers. The Royal Society believed they had found the perfect solution: the breadfruit, a tree from Tahiti that produced large, starchy fruit ideal for feeding plantation workers. To transport it, the Admiralty commissioned a small ship called the Bounty. She wasn't a warship, just 90 feet long with a crew of 46. Her mission was simple on paper: sail from England to Tahiti, collect breadfruit saplings, and carry them to the West Indies. It was a voyage of science, not conquest. But the sea rarely respects simplicity. In December 1787, the Bounty set sail from Spithead, England, under the command of Lieutenant William Bligh, a man who had served under Captain Cook himself. Bligh was only 33, sharp-minded and deeply experienced, but with a temper that burned hotter than the tropics he was bound for. He demanded discipline, precision, and above all, obedience. His second in command was Fletcher Christian, a 23-year-old officer from a modest English family. He was charismatic, educated, and well-liked by the crew. Everything Bligh was not. For months, their partnership worked. They navigated storms, repaired rigging in savage weather, and survived the harsh rounding of Cape Horn. But after repeated gales forced them to turn back, Bligh made a fateful decision: to take the longer route around the Cape of Good Hope. By the time the Bounty reached Tahiti, 10 months later, her men were exhausted, half-starved, and broken by discipline. And then they saw paradise. Tahiti was unlike anything they had ever known. Warm waters, fertile soil, fragrant air, and, most dangerously, freedom. The Tahitians welcomed them with open arms. For 5 months, the crew lived among them, trading tools for food and companionship. Friendships deepened, romances bloomed, and duty became a fading echo. Even Bligh himself softened. He gathered over 1,000 young breadfruit plants, filling the ship's decks with greenery. But as departure neared, tensions returned. For the crew, leaving Tahiti was like being dragged from Eden. For Bligh, it was like herding dreamers back into obedience. He grew harsher, quicker to punish. He accused his officers of theft, laziness, and moral decay. In his logs, he wrote of mutinous spirits. In private, his men whispered of tyranny. On April 28, 1789, somewhere near the island of Tofua in the South Pacific, the tension snapped. At dawn, Bligh was woken by a shout, "Now, Mr. Bligh!"
He opened his eyes to see Fletcher Christian, pistol in hand, flanked by armed men. Bligh demanded to know what this meant. Christian's voice was steady, cold. "I am in hell, sir. I am in hell." The mutineers tied Bligh's hands and forced him on deck. He and 18 loyalists were lowered into a 23-foot launch, a small open boat barely fit for survival. As they drifted away, the Bounty's sails filled once more. Christian stood at the rail, staring down at his captain, the man who had once been his mentor. Neither would ever see England again. For Bligh, survival was now a matter of will. Armed with only a sextant, a compass, and a few days' provisions, he led his men on one of the greatest feats of navigation in maritime history, 3,600 nautical miles across uncharted seas to the Dutch colony of Timor. They survived on rainwater, coconuts, and the occasional fish, enduring storms and hunger that would have broken lesser men. Bligh's discipline, once despised, now became their salvation. By the time they reached land 47 days later, only one man had died. Bligh's return to England was met with both astonishment and outrage. He was hailed as a master navigator and condemned as the man who had lost control of his ship.
Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian and the mutineers faced a different kind of reckoning. They returned briefly to Tahiti, but the idyll had soured. They knew the Royal Navy would come for them, so Christian took a small group, 9 mutineers, 6 Tahitian men, and 12 women, and vanished into the Pacific aboard the Bounty. For years the Admiralty searched. Ships combed the islands, asking questions, chasing rumors. Some said the Bounty had been seen near the Cook Islands, others near Tonga. But no one found her. She had become another ghost of the sea. It wasn't until 1808, nearly 20 years later, that the truth surfaced. An American whaling ship, the Topaz, discovered a tiny island called Pitcairn, far from any known trade route. There they found a small, thriving community speaking an odd English dialect. Their leader was a man named John Adams, the last surviving mutineer. He told a story of paradise turned nightmare. After landing on Pitcairn, the settlers had burned the Bounty to conceal their presence. What began as freedom soon descended into jealousy, violence, and revenge. By 1800, almost every man was dead, Christian among them, reportedly killed during a drunken quarrel. The women and children had survived, rebuilding their world among the ashes. The Bounty's remains were rediscovered in 1957, scattered across the shallow waters of Pitcairn's Bounty Bay. Timbers blackened, nails fused with coral. Today, fragments of her hull still lie beneath the surf, guarded by descendants of those who began as mutineers and ended as settlers. The British government eventually pardoned them all. Time, it seems, forgave what the sea never forgot. The story of the Bounty is often told as a romantic tragedy, the cruel captain and the noble rebel. But history is rarely that simple. Bligh was not the monster his enemies claimed, nor was Christian the hero his legend made him. Both were men of their time, products of an empire that demanded obedience and punished freedom. The mutiny on the Bounty was not born from evil, but from exhaustion. Months of hunger, endless storms, and the cruel arithmetic of naval discipline eroded the human spirit. Tahiti simply offered a glimpse of another life, a life without orders, without the lash, without England's shadow. And once that vision entered their minds, there was no returning. The Bounty never truly vanished. Her name still echoes through centuries of ocean wind. carried in novels, films, and the bloodlines of her descendants on Pitcairn. She endures as both a warning and a question. What happens when men, bound by duty, finally choose themselves over command? The answer is written not in ink, but in salt water. A small ship lost in the Pacific, a captain who walked across the ocean, a rebellion that refused to die. Next time, our voyage continues to another ship swallowed by time, not by mutiny, but by mystery. A ship that vanished with her entire crew, leaving nothing but rumors and the echo of her name in maritime law. There are ships that die quietly. They sink beneath storms, leaving nothing but foam and rumor. And then there are those that vanish with such perfect silence that even the ocean seems afraid to speak their name. The Waratah was one of these. In the year 1909, the British merchant marine was at its golden height. Steamships crossed oceans with a sense of invincibility, carrying empires on their decks. Among these proud vessels was the SS Waratah, built at the Barclay Curle & Co. shipyard in Glasgow for the Blue Anchor Line. She was magnificent, 500 feet long, 9,000 tons, with twin masts, 2 funnels, and the kind of Edwardian luxury that drew comparisons to a floating hotel. Her designer, J.L. Smith, intended her to bridge the world between commerce and comfort, part cargo ship, part passenger liner. To her owners, she was the future. To her crew, she was a beast. When she first launched in 1908, there were whispers. Some engineers noted her narrow hull and top-heavy structure. She carried 2 full decks of cabins and a promenade piled above a freight hull meant for wool, tallow, and frozen meat. On paper, she was seaworthy, but those who worked her decks said otherwise. Her first captain, Ilbury, boasted that she could dance like a lady. Her officers muttered that she rolled like a drunkard.
Still, the Blue Anchor Line pressed on. The Waratah made her maiden voyage from London to Sydney without incident. She was christened the Titanic of the Southern Hemisphere, though, at the time, the Titanic itself had yet to sail. It was on her return voyage, 1 year later, that she would disappear forever. On June 26, 1909, the Waratah left Sydney for London, stopping first at Melbourne, then Durban, with a planned final leg to Cape Town. She carried 211 passengers and crew, plus a cargo worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, mostly wool, frozen meat, and precious metals. Among her passengers was Captain Joshua Islebury, a veteran sailor nearing retirement, and a mix of merchants, emigrants, and colonial families returning to England. They dined on fine china, strolled beneath electric lights, and sipped brandy in a lounge paneled with Australian cedar. To all appearances, life aboard the Waratah was calm, but below the surface, something was wrong. Several passengers later testified that the ship had an unsettling motion, a persistent roll that made walking difficult even in calm seas. One traveler, Captain C.W.P. Islebury, brother of the commander, reportedly confided that the Waratah feels top-heavy, as if she could turn turtle in a following sea. The ship reached Durban on July 25, 1909. There, some passengers disembarked, unnerved by her behavior. One, a name named W.L. Saunders, later told newspapers that he had a premonition something would happen. He said, "I could not bring myself to reboard her. She looked wrong, the way she moved in the water." The Waratah departed Durban on July 26th, bound for Cape Town. She never arrived. The last confirmed sighting came from the steamer Clan McIntyre, traveling the same route that afternoon. At around 4 p.m., Captain Bruce of the Clan McIntyre saw the Waratah off his port bow, about 10 miles away, smoke billowing gently from her twin funnels. The two ships exchanged signals, friendly greetings, and then drifted apart. By sunset, the Waratah had vanished into the horizon. No distress call was sent. No wreckage was found. When she failed to reach Cape Town by August 1st, the alarm was raised. The search effort was massive. Naval vessels and merchant ships combed the waters between Durban and Cape Town for weeks. Messages were wired to Madagascar and the Cocos Islands. Families waited at docks across 3 continents, clinging to hope that she had simply lost radio contact. But the days turned to weeks, and the silence deepened. A single piece of possible debris, a cork life buoy stamped Waratah, washed ashore near East London, South Africa, but it could not be confirmed. The sea, as always, had swallowed its evidence whole.
In the aftermath, theories filled the void where facts should have been. The first and simplest, she capsized. Many experts believed that her design, narrow hull, high center of gravity, made her unstable in heavy seas. A sudden wave, perhaps a rogue swell, could have rolled her past the point of recovery. But others noted that Captain Ilbrey was no fool. He had crossed the Indian Ocean for 40 years. Would he really take such a vessel into known winter storms? Then came the coal explosion theory, that a buildup of coal gas in her bunkers had caused an internal blast, sinking her instantly. Yet no oil slick, no debris, no body ever surfaced. A third theory suggested she had broken her back, the term sailors use when a ship's spine snaps under extreme stress. The Indian Ocean is treacherous, and rogue waves over 50 feet are not uncommon. A steel hull struck by one such monster could easily buckle and vanish in minutes. Finally, the most haunting theory of all, that she had been swallowed whole by a Cape roller, a wave so immense it breaks not with fury, but with weight, a mountain of water collapsing in total silence. In that moment, all lights would have gone out, all sound would have died. The Waratah would have ceased to exist. For years, relatives refused to give up. Letters flooded the Admiralty from mothers and widows demanding more searches. The Blue Anchor Line suffered a financial collapse soon after. By 1910, the company was dissolved, its reputation ruined. The ocean, indifferent to human grief, carried on. And yet, the legend grew. Sailors along the South African coast began reporting phantom lights. A 2-funneled liner glimpsed in fog, her decks aglow, before vanishing behind rain. Fishermen whispered that the Waratah still sailed the Agulhas current on stormy nights, her passengers eternally waiting for landfall. But history offers no ghosts, only reminders. In 1971, oceanographer Bruce Rule used sonar to map the seafloor off the Wild Coast, searching for anomalies that could be the Waratah. He found several, long steel shapes half buried in sand, but none could be confirmed as the Waratah. Subsequent expeditions in 1997, 2001, and 2013 yielded the same frustration: silence, darkness, and miles of indifferent sea. The Waratah's resting place remains unknown. For historians, her story stands as a turning point, the last great unsolved maritime mystery before the Titanic. She represents the hubris of an age that believed human engineering could tame the elements. But the ocean does not care for blueprints. Every wave is older than civilization. The Waratah was built for pride, dressed in elegance, and destroyed by the one force that never forgives arrogance. She carried 211 souls, and with them a century's worth of confidence in steel. All of it lost, not in fire or explosion, but in the quiet logic of nature reclaiming what was hers.
In her absence, she became Myth, the Titanic of the South Seas. But her true story is simpler and sadder. A ship that never should have sailed, a captain who trusted too much, and an empire that mistook progress for invincibility. The ocean does not lose ships, it keeps them. And somewhere, beneath the cold green currents of the Indian Ocean, the Waratah still sleeps, perfectly preserved, perfectly silent, carrying her passengers forever between Durban and Cape Town. Next, we turn from mystery to war, to a ship that vanished not in silence, but under fire. A vessel whose final message was a cry across the radio, "We are sinking fast, but we are not alone." The ocean is the oldest battlefield on Earth. Empires have fought across it, preyed upon it, and drowned in it. But no navy, no matter how mighty, has ever truly conquered it, and few reminders of that truth are as haunting as the story of the USS Cyclops, the largest ship in the U.S. Navy to vanish without a trace. This isn't legend. There were no storms, no distress calls, and no survivors. Just a ship the size of a city block that simply ceased to exist. In 1910, as the United States rose to global power, the Navy commissioned a new class of colliers, massive ships designed to carry coal to its growing fleet of steel warships. Among them was the USS Cyclops, AC-4, launched from Philadelphia's William Cramp and Sons shipyard in 1910. She was a technological marvel of her age, 542 feet long, 65 feet wide, 19,000 tons, with engines powerful enough to move her across the Atlantic at 15 knots. Her hull was built for strength, her steel plating layered thick to endure the roughest seas. She wasn't built to fight, she was built to serve. Cyclops fed the Navy's hunger for coal, keeping dreadnoughts and cruisers running. In peacetime, she was a workhorse. In wartime, she became essential. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Cyclops was assigned to the Naval Auxiliary Force, hauling manganese and coal between the Caribbean, Brazil, and the East Coast. Her commander at that time was Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, a man known less for his leadership and more for his temper. Worley was a merchant mariner turned officer, German-born, naturalized American, and by all accounts, a man both brilliant and unpredictable. Sailors described him as a strict disciplinarian with a sharp tongue, and at times, unstable moods. One officer would later recall, "The captain was not a man you crossed twice, but he knew his ship. He ruled it like his kingdom."
In January 1918, Cyclops left Norfolk, Virginia, bound for Rio de Janeiro. Her mission? Deliver coal to American warships stationed in the South Atlantic. She made the crossing safely, arriving in February and unloading her cargo. There, she was loaded with manganese ore, a dense, heavy mineral essential for steel production. With the holds full, she prepared to return to Baltimore. On February 15th, she departed Rio with 309 souls aboard, sailors, officers, and a few passengers, including the American Consul General. Her estimated arrival in Baltimore, mid-March. She never arrived. Cyclops stopped once, briefly, at the island of Barbados on March 3rd, to refuel and take on supplies. Witnesses described her sitting low in the water, heavily laden, but stable. Captain Worley reported all was well. The weather was clear, the engines strong, and the ship in good order. She left Barbados that same day, and then she was gone. No SOS, no distress flare,
No floating wreckage. Not a single lifeboat, barrel, or plank was ever found. The Cyclops had sailed into what sailors called the Devil's Triangle, the stretch of ocean between Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and Florida that would later become infamous as the Bermuda Triangle. But in 1918, it was just another trade route, and her disappearance became one of the greatest mysteries in naval history. The U.S. Navy launched an immediate search. Dozens of vessels combed the sea lanes between Barbados and the mainland. Telegrams were sent to ports in Cuba, Jamaica, Trinidad, and the Carolinas. Weeks passed. Nothing. Finally, the Navy issued a statement. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops is one of the most complete and baffling mysteries in the history of the Navy. It remains so today. So what happened? Over the years, investigators proposed many theories, each more plausible or chilling than the last. 1. Structural failure. Cyclops was enormous, but not invincible. Her hull, designed before the lessons of modern shipbuilding, may have had a fatal weakness. If she encountered a heavy storm or rogue wave, the stress could have fractured her spine. The same breaking her back phenomenon that doomed other large ships of her era. But here's the problem. There was no report of bad weather on her route. The seas were calm that week. And a ship of her size doesn't simply vanish. It leaves debris, oil slicks, something.
2. Overloading. Cyclops left Brazil carrying nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore, denser than coal and much heavier than standard cargo. If improperly loaded, the ore could have shifted mid-sea, causing her to capsize suddenly. This remains the most accepted theory among naval engineers. A list, a roll, a cascade of weight, and she could have turned turtle in under a minute. No time for distress calls, no time to abandon ship. Just silence. 3. Sabotage or mutiny. The most controversial theory centered on Captain Worley himself. Rumors emerged after the war that Worley had pro-German sympathies, a dangerous suspicion during wartime. Some speculated he had defected, taking the ship to a secret harbor. Others suggested his erratic behavior provoked a mutiny, leading to chaos and destruction at sea. But the Navy dismissed these claims. There was no evidence, only whispers and prejudice. 4. Enemy attack. Could a German U-boat have sunk her? The war was still raging in 1918, and U-boats roamed the Atlantic freely. But no German records ever mentioned engaging or sinking a vessel resembling the Cyclops. And again, no wreckage, no survivors, nothing. 5. The magnetic theory. Later, in the 20th century, sensationalists proposed the idea of a magnetic anomaly or electrical disturbance in the region known as the Bermuda Triangle. But science has long dismissed this. Cyclops' fate was not supernatural, it was mechanical, human, or environmental. Yet, even with all our technology, we still haven't found her. Cyclops was not the last of her kind to disappear. 2 of her sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, vanished in almost identical circumstances during World War II, both carrying heavy ore cargoes along nearly the same route. Neither was ever recovered. 3 ships, the same design, the same ocean, the same silence. Coincidence or design flaw? Naval historians still debate it.
What's certain is that 309 people aboard the Cyclops were erased from the record of the living. Their names fill a long plaque at the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. Officers, engineers, cooks, sailors. Men who woke one morning to the endless rhythm of the sea and never saw land again. Their last letters home spoke of routine. "We'll be back by spring. The weather's fine, nothing to worry about." They could not have known that they were writing their final words. In 1968, nearly half a century later, the U.S. Navy began an expedition to chart old wrecks along the Bermuda and Puerto Rico Trench. They hoped to locate the Cyclops using sonar. They found fragments of merchant vessels, war wrecks, submarines, but never her. Even with modern technology, her coordinates remain blank, a hole in the map. For all its speculation, the Cyclops tragedy reveals an uncomfortable truth about human progress. Even at the height of modern industry and war, with steel and engines and wireless radio, the sea still holds dominion. The same force that swallowed wooden galleons in the age of sail could erase a steel titan in the age of machines. In the end, it wasn't witchcraft or curses that took the Cyclops. It was gravity, weight, and time. A ship too heavy, a captain too proud, an ocean too deep. To this day, her wreck has never been found. Somewhere in the cobalt depths of the Sargasso Sea, beyond the range of sunlight, her massive hull may still lie, upright, silent, her decks frozen in place, plates set for dinner, bunks made, clocks stopped at the moment of her end. An underwater museum of unanswered questions. The U.S. Navy still lists her as lost at sea. No wreckage, no bodies, no closure. Just the memory of a ship that fed the war machine and then fed the sea. Next time, we travel backward again, to the age of exploration, to a Spanish galleon loaded with gold, cursed by greed and hunted by storms. A ship whose treasure still glimmers beneath the waves.
The ocean remembers everything it devours, especially gold. No sound travels farther than greed upon the sea. For more than 3 centuries, divers, kings, and thieves have hunted one ship more than any other, the San Jose, the Spanish galleon that went down in flames with a fortune so vast that it could have rebuilt an empire. She carried not just treasure, but the ambition of Spain itself. And when she sank, she took an era with her. By the late 1600s, Spain's might was built on ships like the San Jose. For 2 centuries, her fleets had ferried gold and silver from the mines of Peru and Colombia to the vaults of Madrid. The San Jose was no ordinary galleon. She was a fortress of oak and iron, 64 guns mounted across 2 decks, and a hull painted in black and gold. When she set sail from Portobello, Panama, in 1708, she carried more than 200 tons of treasure, chests filled with silver coins, gold ingots, emeralds, and pearls harvested from the coasts of New Granada. Her official value was listed at 11 million pesos, roughly $20 billion today. But her real cargo was political survival. At the time, Europe was engulfed in the War of the Spanish Succession. Spain and France were allied against Britain and the Netherlands, and gold was the bloodstream of that alliance. Without it, Spain could not fund its armies, feed its soldiers, or maintain its navy. Every piece of 8 aboard the San Jose represented 1 more month of war. The San Jose was part of the treasure fleet of 1708, commanded by José Fernández de Santillan, an experienced admiral tasked with escorting 17 merchant ships from the Caribbean back to Spain. The fleet waited in Cartagena for months, hiding behind the fortified walls as British privateers prowled the Caribbean. By early June, the admiral faced a cruel choice. The hurricane season was approaching, and his men were growing restless. The British were sighted off the coast, but supplies were dwindling. Santillan made the call. They would sail at dusk on June 8, 1708. It would be the last order he ever gave. Off the coast of Colombia, near the island of Baru, the treasure fleet encountered the British squadron under Commodore Charles Wager. Her flagship, the HMS Expedition, was smaller but faster, her crew eager for prize money. At around 7 p.m., the British closed in on the San Jose. Gunfire split the evening calm. Witnesses later recalled the exchange as one of the most violent sea battles of the age. Gunsmoke blanketing the waves, flashes lighting the dusk like lightning. Then, in a heartbeat, it ended.
A shot, perhaps from the expedition, struck the San Jose's powder magazine. The explosion shattered her hull, split her masts, and hurled burning debris across the sea. Within minutes, she was gone. Only 11 survivors were pulled from the water. Over 600 men and an empire's fortune went down in a plume of fire. The sea turned black with smoke and gold. The news reached Madrid like a funeral bell. King Philip V declared days of mourning, not for the men, but for the treasure. That single loss crippled Spain's economy for a generation. Wars were lost, alliances broken, colonies left undefended. The San Jose had been more than a ship. It was the spine of an empire. For centuries, treasure hunters searched for her wreck, but the sea kept its secret well. The currents off Cartagena are treacherous, the seabed uneven and shrouded in sand. Dozens of expeditions came and failed. Some claimed to find her, others vanished in their own right. By the 20th century, the San Jose had become legend, half history, half myth. Stories said her gold was cursed, that those who sought it met the same fate as those who carried it. But behind the superstition lay simple reality. The wreck was too deep, the evidence too scarce, and the ocean too vast. In 1982, an American company, Sea Search Armada, announced that it had located what it believed to be the San Jose, about 20 miles off Cartagena. They submitted coordinates and claimed salvage rights under Colombian law. The Colombian government refused, declaring that the wreck and everything within belonged to the nation. A legal battle began that would last for decades as technology advanced and underwater archaeology emerged from myth into science. Then, in 2015, the Colombian Navy, working with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, finally announced a verified discovery. Using an autonomous submersible, they located a wreck nearly 1,000 meters deep. The sonar scans showed a ship with bronze cannons engraved with dolphins, the same markings listed in the San Jose's construction records. She had been found. The president of Colombia declared it the most valuable treasure in the history of humanity. But no one could touch it. The wreck lies in sovereign waters, protected under UNESCO conventions. Every artifact, from a gold coin to a spoon, belongs not to treasure hunters, but to history.
Photographs taken by the submersible showed a haunting tableau. The ship's guns encrusted in coral, ceramic jars still intact, and in the soft sand around the hull, faint glints of yellow, gold coins scattered like seeds. Marine archaeologists identified fragments of hull timber, perfectly preserved in oxygen-poor water. The San Jose had landed upright, as if still sailing toward home. Her decks were torn open by the explosion, yet her shape remained whole, a ghost frozen in motion. The water around her was undisturbed, silent. Even the fish avoided her shadow. The images were broadcast worldwide, but for the descendants of those who died, they were more than relics. They were gravestones. For them, the ship was not treasure, it was a tomb. In the years that followed, the San Jose became the focus of a new kind of war, one fought not with cannons, but with lawyers and ethics committees. Colombia claimed ownership as the site lay within its territorial waters. Spain asserted that, as a state vessel, the galleon remained its property under international law. Meanwhile, indigenous groups in Bolivia argued that much of the gold had been mined by enslaved labor from their ancestors, and that they too had a claim. The debate continues to this day. Who owns history when history is buried beneath the sea? The nation that built it? The people who died with it? Or the sea itself, which never signed a treaty, never declared war, never surrendered its dead? Archaeologists plan to raise part of the San Jose within the next decade, using remote-operated cranes to recover artifacts before time and salt claim them. But some fear that disturbing the wreck will destroy it. For more than 300 years, it has rested untouched, preserved by darkness. To lift it now would be to awaken ghosts, if not of men, then of history's conscience. The San Jose represents a paradox, the pinnacle of human craftsmanship and the depth of human greed. Her story is not of a curse, but of consequence. Spain's empire thrived on conquest and gold, but both demanded a price that could never be paid. Every coin mined in the New World carried blood in its reflection. When the San Jose exploded, it was not merely a tragedy, it was justice written in flame.
The loss of the San Jose marked the beginning of Spain's decline as a global superpower. Her treasure fleet system was broken. Her enemies grew stronger. Within a century, the British dominated the seas, and Spain's colonies began to rebel. But beneath that historical narrative lies a quieter truth. The ship's final voyage reflected a human story repeated across ages, our attempt to command the elements, to cage wealth, to make permanence out of the transient. And the ocean, as always, refused. Today, the coordinates of the San Jose remain a state secret, protected by the Colombian Navy. Her decks lie buried under sediment, her guns still pointing upward toward the world that forgot her. She is not a legend anymore. She is real, alive in the darkness, a time capsule of empire and ambition. If she is ever raised, it will not be gold that gleams first. It will be mirrors. Mirrors that reflect back everything humanity has ever lost, chasing fortune across the sea. The San Jose does not need to be found again. She already told her story the moment she sank. A ship of gold, a sea of blood, and an empire that mistook possession for power. Next, our voyage turns north, to the cold gray waters where explorers sought the edges of the world and found only ice. A ship that froze, vanished, and reappeared 170 years later beneath the Arctic. There are places on Earth where time stops, where the sun circles the horizon but never rises, and the air itself seems to remember. The Arctic is one such place. It has no mercy, no pity,
and no room for error. For centuries, explorers have gone there chasing glory and geography, believing that courage could defeat cold. But courage freezes too. And few stories capture that truth like the fate of HMS Erebus and the men who followed Sir John Franklin into the white silence. The early 19th century was the age of maps and empires. Every coastline had been drawn, every continent claimed, except the top of the world. There, across the Arctic archipelago of Canada, lay a dream, the Northwest Passage, a fabled sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the polar ice. Whoever found it would control global trade, shorten voyages by months, and secure a place in history. By 1845, Britain had already sent dozens of expeditions north, most of them failures. Ships returned battered, frozen, or not at all. But none carried the prestige or preparation of the voyage led by Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old naval officer with a lifetime of Arctic experience and a reputation as both a hero and a relic of another age. Franklin was chosen not because he was the best navigator, but because he was steady, a man who embodied the moral courage the Admiralty prized above innovation. He had one order: find the Northwest Passage or die trying.
The expedition consisted of 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Both were former bomb vessels, squat, heavily reinforced, and equipped for Arctic conditions. Each ship was retrofitted with the latest Victorian technology: iron plating, steam engines powered by locomotive boilers, and a heating system that pumped warm air through the decks. They were floating fortresses against nature, the product of the best minds in Britain. Their provisions were enough for 3 years: salted beef, biscuits, tinned vegetables, cocoa, rum, and 8,000 pounds of tobacco. They even carried a 1,200-volume library and a camera, among the first to record polar landscapes. The crew numbered 129 men, chosen from the Royal Navy's finest. When they sailed from Greenhithe on May 19, 1845, they were confident, perhaps too much so. The Arctic, after all, had claimed many before them. But Franklin was certain that science and faith would prevail. He told one officer, "We are as prepared as men can be." He was wrong. The ships were last seen by European eyes on July 26, 1845 in Baffin Bay by whalers heading south. The Erebus and Terror were waiting for ice to clear before entering Lancaster Sound. After that, they disappeared. Months passed, then years. No message, no sighting, no wreckage. The Admiralty, reluctant to admit failure, waited 2 years before sending rescue missions. Between 1848 and 1859, dozens of expeditions scoured the Arctic in one of the largest searches in maritime history. They found traces, scraps of wood, empty camps, a few graves on bleak islands, but no ships. Rumors began to replace facts. Inuit hunters told stories of 3 ships trapped in the ice, of starving men dragging boats overland, of cannibalism. At home, the newspapers alternated between hailing Franklin as a martyr and condemning the Admiralty for its arrogance. It wasn't until 1859 that the truth began to surface. That summer, a search team led by Francis Leopold McClintock discovered a stone cairn on King William Island. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a message left in 1847 and updated in 1848 by the last survivors. The first note was cheerful: "All well." The second, scrawled in the margins a year later, was not. It read, April 25th, 1848. HMS Terror and Erebus abandoned, 5 leagues NNW of this. Sir John Franklin died June 11th, 1847. Total loss by deaths to this date, 9 officers and 15 men. The survivors, 105 in total, had begun a desperate march south toward the Back River, hoping to find rescue. They never made it. Over the following decades, explorers and Inuit witnesses pieced together their final days, starving men dragging lifeboats across the ice, some turning back, others resorting to eating the dead. Their bones were later found along the route, marked by knife cuts, the terrible confirmation that even discipline breaks in the face of cold.
For more than 160 years, the wrecks of the Erebus and Terror remained missing. The Arctic gave up bones and buttons, spoons and journals, but not the ships themselves. Then, in 2014, a Canadian expedition using sonar and underwater drones finally found HMS Erebus in the Queen Maud Gulf, lying upright only 36 feet below the surface. The discovery was staggering. Her hull was nearly intact, her deck preserved by the freezing water and the silt that covered her like a shroud. When divers entered her cabins, they found wine bottles still sealed, china neatly stacked, and furniture frozen in place. It was as though the crew had only just stepped away. 2 years later, in 2016, the HMS Terror was found 60 miles north in even better condition. Her hull unbroken, her masts still standing, her windows closed tight. Inside, drawers remained shut, compasses unmoved. The ships had not sunk in battle or storm. They had been slowly crushed and entombed by ice, preserved in the deep like sleeping giants. The wrecks were declared National Historic Sites of Canada, and the area placed under joint stewardship with the Inuit Heritage Trust. For archaeologists, the finds offered answers and more questions. Artifacts recovered from the ships tell a story of endurance and collapse. Tin cans with lead solder suggest poisoning from contaminated food, which may have caused madness or fatigue. Skeletal analysis shows signs of scurvy, starvation, and in some cases, blunt force trauma. But more haunting than any evidence is what it says about Victorian belief that technology, faith, and hierarchy could triumph over nature. They brought a miniature world of England with them into the Arctic: uniforms, silverware, hymnals, and flags. They died, in part, because they could not let go of that world. When the sledges became too heavy, they kept dragging furniture instead of food. It was not incompetence, it was conviction. What destroyed the Franklin expedition was not a single error, but a slow accumulation of small ones. They carried food sealed with industrial lead, unaware of its toxicity. Their steam engines, so advanced in London, were useless against polar ice. And their faith in maps that did not exist blinded them to the truth the Inuit already knew, that survival in the Arctic was not about conquest, but humility. When later explorers asked Inuit elders what they had seen, one replied, "They were not men of the land. They did not listen to the ice." It was a lesson carved in frost.
When the Erebus was found, her bell was the first artifact raised from the wreck. It bears a Latin inscription, 1845, HMS Erebus. The sound it made when struck for the first time in 170 years echoed across the bay, a metallic note swallowed by wind and water. For historians, it was the voice of the past calling home. The wrecks are now protected under strict conservation laws. Divers must work carefully,
preserving wood and cloth against decay. Each artifact recovered is treated not as treasure, but as testimony. Every button, every book, every bone tells of a time when humans believed the poles could be tamed by discipline and courage alone. The story of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror is not about failure. It is about the limits of certainty. The men of the Franklin expedition were not foolish or reckless. They were the best their country could offer, skilled, loyal, and brave. But the Arctic is not a place for mastery. It is a mirror. It reflects our pride, our innovation, and our fragility all at once. When the ice closed over those ships, it sealed more than their fate. It sealed an era. The age of heroic exploration was ending. The modern world was beginning. Today, the Erebus and Terror rest within the frozen labyrinth of Nunavut. Each spring, when the ice breaks and the sea breathes again, divers descend to check their preservation. Inside, plates still lie on tables. Books still sit on shelves. In one cabin, a pair of boots stands beside a bunk, waiting for a man who will never wake. The Arctic preserved them not out of mercy, but out of indifference. The sea took them, and the cold kept them. In their stillness, they remind us that exploration is never just discovery, it is confrontation, not with the world, but with ourselves. The Erebus may be silent, but its lesson endures. No map is worth a man's life. No glory outlasts the ice. Next, we sail south to warmer seas and a different kind of disappearance, one not caused by ice or war, but by wealth, betrayal, and ambition. A luxury liner built for paradise, gone without a trace in the Pacific.
Every century has its ghosts. Some haunt cities, others linger in the wild, but a few drift endlessly across the ocean, invisible, unconfirmed, unforgettable. One of these was the SS Waratah of the Pacific, a luxury liner that vanished so completely that she became known as Australia's Titanic. She promised comfort, elegance, and safety, a floating palace for the rich and hopeful. Yet her story ended in silence, somewhere between Sydney and Suva, under a sunlit sky. No storm, no signal, no trace. Only a question that would haunt mariners for generations. How can something so magnificent simply cease to exist? The SS Waratah of the Pacific was launched from the Cockatoo Island dockyard in 1911, a masterpiece of Australian shipbuilding at the dawn of a new age. She was commissioned by the Australasian Steam Navigation Company, built to rival the grand liners of Europe. At 520 feet long, she could carry more than 1,200 passengers and 300 crew. Her decks were polished teak. Her smoking rooms smelled of tobacco and oak. The grand dining hall boasted electric chandeliers, still a novelty in many homes. She represented more than transport. She was proof that Australia could build her own gateway to the world. Newspapers called her the jewel of the Pacific. Travelers called her home between continents. But sailors, even before she sailed, whispered that she was cursed. The Waratah of the Pacific was built quickly, too quickly, some engineers claimed. Her hull design was copied from British liners, but adapted for lighter steel, giving her an unusually high profile. It made her elegant, but unsteady. She rolled easily, especially when loaded unevenly. A worker who helped rivet her hull later told reporters, "She was beautiful, yes, but she was tall and proud, too proud. A ship should humble itself to the sea." Before her first voyage, inspectors argued over her stability. The company insisted she was sound. After all, confidence sold tickets.
On February 28, 1912, the Waratah of the Pacific left Sydney for Suva, Fiji, carrying 642 passengers, businessmen, missionaries, honeymooners, and immigrants chasing new lives. She was scheduled to reach Fiji within 6 days. She never arrived. The weather on that voyage was calm, the seas unusually flat. Two other vessels, the SS Moresby and SS Rakea, reported seeing the Waratah early on March 2nd, about 200 miles northeast of Brisbane. She was steaming steadily, smoke curling from her twin funnels. Captain Thomas Henry of the Moresby even signaled her, "Fine weather ahead." The Waratah signaled back, "Proceeding full speed." That was the last communication anyone received.
When she failed to reach Suva by March 6th, the alarm spread across the Pacific. Search vessels were dispatched from Sydney, Auckland, and Fiji, but no wreckage, oil slick, or lifeboats were found. Not a single plank floated to shore. It was as though she had been erased. The Australian government launched one of the most extensive maritime searches in its history. For 7 weeks, ships traced every possible route between Australia and Fiji. Air patrols, still in their infancy, scouted the Coral Sea for drifting debris, but the ocean gave back nothing. A month later, fishermen off New Caledonia claimed to see wreckage, a deck chair, a woman's hat, but it could not be confirmed. Newspapers across the empire turned the Waratah into a national obsession. How can a ship so large, so modern, vanish without storm or struggle? Some speculated she had struck an uncharted reef. Others imagined fire, explosion, even sabotage. Still others invoked the supernatural, a Pacific triangle, a mirror to Bermuda's mystery. But investigators had only the evidence of absence, and that is the hardest evidence to understand. 1. The structural failure theory. Shipbuilders later speculated that the Waratah of the Pacific was top-heavy, her upper decks too wide for her keel. If her cargo shifted even slightly in rough water, she could have capsized in seconds. A sudden list, a turn of the propeller, and she would have flipped silently, dragging everyone with her. Such a disaster could leave little trace. The Coral Sea is deep, over 14,000 feet in places. A ship that sank there would vanish entirely, pressure crushed before it hit the seafloor. 2. The fire in the hold. Another theory suggests that spontaneous combustion in her coal bunkers caused an internal fire. Such fires were common in steamships. If the flames reached the boiler room, a catastrophic explosion could follow. Yet no fragments or charred debris ever washed ashore, and neighboring vessels reported no flashes or sound. 3. The human factor. Some suggested navigation error. The Waratah may have veered off course to avoid reefs, drifting into uncharted waters where a submerged volcanic shelf could have torn her hull open. The Pacific, even today, hides thousands of such hazards beneath tranquil waves.
When no sign of the ship emerged, the Admiralty declared her lost. Memorials were erected in Sydney and Suva, engraved with the names of the 642 who vanished. Their families received compensation, but never closure. In the following years, ghost stories began. Islanders in the Solomons spoke of a white ship seen gliding silently through fog. A missionary in 1915 claimed he saw a hull half submerged near a reef, but could never find it again. Each sighting reignited hope and reopened grief. By the 1930s, treasure hunters and divers began calling her the Pacific's Phantom Queen. Books, songs, and newspaper serials turned her into myth. But for the relatives of the lost, it was not myth. It was unfinished mourning. In 2009, a century after her disappearance, a joint Australian-Fijian expedition used sonar scanning to survey the seafloor between Brisbane and Suva. At 3,600 meters deep, they found a large metallic anomaly, roughly the size and shape of a liner. But the depth and silt made identification impossible without advanced robotics. Later missions were postponed due to cost, and the exact coordinates remain classified by the Australian Maritime Safety Authority to prevent looting. Experts believe this is almost certainly the Waratah of the Pacific. If confirmed, it would close one of the last great maritime mysteries of the early 20th century. But until someone descends those depths and reads her nameplate, the truth remains just out of reach. The Waratah's story speaks to something deeper than lost metal and lives. It reveals how fragile human confidence was in the face of progress. The early 1900s were an age of faith in machinery, of steam and steel and empire. People believed the ocean could be conquered. The tragedy was a relic of wooden ships and superstition. But the Waratah's vanishing shattered that illusion. Her story predated the Titanic by only a few months, yet her disappearance was even more complete. No wreck, no survivors, no goodbye. For engineers and sailors alike, she became a warning. Perfection is never unsinkable, and the sea, no matter how charted, will always choose its own. Today, maritime historians consider the Waratah of the Pacific a symbol of transition between old-world optimism and modern humility. She was the last great liner of an age that believed technology could master fate. And she proved that fate does not answer to technology. If her wreck is ever found, it will likely show a mundane cause, a structural imbalance, a shift in weight, a human mistake. But that is precisely what makes her tragic. Not a monster, not a storm, not an act of God, but a few inches of steel in the wrong place, a moment's inattention, and an ocean that does not forgive.
Each year, cruise ships pass near where she vanished. Passengers dine under stars, unaware that far below them lies a forgotten ship once as proud as theirs. In the archives of Sydney, you can still find her passenger list. Names of miners, mothers, musicians, and missionaries, all frozen in time. They had packed for paradise. Instead, they became part of the ocean's memory. And so the Waratah of the Pacific joins that quiet fleet of vanished ships, the ones that remind us that progress has always been a gamble against the elements. The sea never loses, it only waits. Next, we turn from peace to war again, to the story of a ship that didn't vanish into silence, but into radio static and panic. A warship whose last words still echo through the night air. All officers, including the captain, are dead. The ship is sinking fast. Strange creatures are rising out of the sea. Some stories of the sea are built from truth, others from terror, and sometimes the two are the same thing. The ocean hides many secrets, but few have been whispered with such dread as the tale of the SS Orang Medan, a ship said to have sent one of the strangest distress calls ever recorded. Her name has become shorthand for the unknown, a message from nowhere, a crew dead without wounds, and an ending that defied every explanation. But who was she? Did she exist at all? Or was she a myth born from the fog between war, secrecy, and science? It began, as many sea legends do, with a signal. In June 1947, some reports say February 1948, ships traveling through the Straits of Malacca between Sumatra and Malaysia began receiving a faint SOS in Morse code. The message was erratic, breaking through static and atmospheric interference. SOS from Orang Medan. We float. All officers, including the captain, are dead in chart room and on bridge.
possibly whole crew dead. There was a long pause, then one final transmission, chilling in its simplicity. I die. After that, silence. Several vessels picked up the signal, but the nearest was the American merchant ship Silver Star, en route from Shanghai to Costa Rica. Her captain, Charles Moore, altered course immediately and began tracing the distress signal's coordinates. Hours later, the crew of the Silver Star spotted smoke on the horizon. A freighter loomed into view, drifting listlessly with no sign of life. On her stern was the name Orang Medan, Dutch for Man of Medan. She appeared undamaged. Her hull was clean, her masts upright, her lifeboat still secured. But the quiet that hung over her was unnatural. A boarding party of 8 men approached by lifeboat. What they found on deck would haunt them for the rest of their lives.
Every crewman aboard the Orang Medan was dead. Their bodies lay sprawled across the decks and bridge, eyes wide open, mouths frozen in silent screams. Some pointed toward the sky, others clutched their chests. Even the ship's dog was found dead, teeth bared as if in mid-snarl. There were no injuries, no gunshots, no burns, no blood. Just expressions of horror and agony, as though they had all seen something unspeakable at once. The temperature on deck was scorching, tropical heat, yet witnesses described an unnatural chill that clung to the air, as if the ship itself were frozen from within. The radio operator was still at his station, hand on the key, eyes staring at nothing. Below decks, the same. The engineers lay collapsed near their equipment. The officers' quarters were untouched, food still on tables, logbooks open mid-sentence. Even the cargo holds seemed undisturbed. As the boarding crew searched for answers, smoke began to curl from the lower deck. Within minutes, flames erupted, sudden, violent, and unexplainable. The Americans barely escaped back to their lifeboat before a series of explosions tore through the hull. They cut their lines and drifted away, watching as the Orang Medan burned. Moments later, she exploded. Her hull lifted out of the water and split apart before sinking beneath the waves. The Silver Star crew recorded the event in their log, but they never found a cause, not for the deaths, not for the fire, not for the ship itself. All evidence went down with her. The story spread quickly across maritime circles. A ship full of corpses, eyes wide in terror. A last message, I die. An explosion and nothing left. But where fact ends, speculation begins. 1. Poison gas. One of the most accepted explanations is that the Orang Medan was carrying a cargo of chemical agents, possibly cyanide or nerve gas, remnants of Japanese or German stockpiles from World War II. If a leak occurred, the fumes could have killed the crew instantly. Phosgene or hydrogen cyanide would cause suffocation and convulsions, leaving victims' bodies contorted, and panic would explain the desperate final messages. The heat of the reaction could later have caused the explosion that destroyed the ship. Yet no official records list such a vessel. No Dutch, American, or British maritime registry contains the Orang Medan's name.
2. Carbon monoxide. A simpler theory holds that the ship's boiler malfunctioned, leaking carbon monoxide into the ventilation system. Gradual poisoning would have caused confusion, hallucination, and death without visible injuries. But even this fails to explain the immediate panic reported by the rescuers, or why the entire crew appeared struck down in an instant. 3. Cold War secrecy.
A darker explanation places the event in the shadow of post-war espionage. In 1947, Allied and Soviet agents were known to smuggle captured chemical weapons through Southeast Asia for study or resale. Some historians suggest the Orang Medan was a ghost freighter, operating off-record with a mixed crew, transporting illegal cargo under false registry. If that cargo leaked, those involved might have destroyed all trace to prevent diplomatic scandal. The explosion, then, was not an accident, but a cover-up. 4. The myth hypothesis. Skeptics argue the entire story was a fabrication, a maritime urban legend that began with a 1952 Coast Guard report published in Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council. The article cited earlier sources from Dutch and German newspapers, but none ever produced primary evidence. No ship logs, no registry, just retellings. Over time, the legend snowballed, acquiring new details with each retelling. And yet, the Silver Star's logs from 1947 exist. They mention an unidentified vessel found adrift in the Malacca Strait, though the name is illegible from water damage. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps the truth was quietly erased before it could be confirmed. The name Orang Medan itself adds to the confusion. In Malay, Orang means man, and Medan refers to the port city on Sumatra's northern coast. It would translate to man from Medan. But no shipping company in Medan operated such a vessel. No dock worker remembered seeing her, and her nameplate, according to accounts, looked freshly painted, as though she had been renamed just before sailing. Who was her owner? Where was she registered? And what was she really carrying? These questions remain unanswered.
Modern maritime historians divide into two camps: those who consider the Orang Medan a myth, and those who believe it was real but covered up. For the latter, small clues point to plausibility. The Silver Star was a real ship, documented in U.S. maritime records. The timeline matches a period of heavy clandestine cargo movement in the region. Several independent accounts of a derelict ship near Sumatra appeared in Asian newspapers between 1947 and 1948. None mention the name Orang Medan, but all describe the same details: drifting freighter, dead crew, no explanation. It is possible that the Orang Medan was a real incident under a different name, a story retold and reshaped until its original identity was lost. Whatever its truth, the story of the Orang Medan endures because it reflects a universal fear: death without reason, silence without closure. For sailors, it became a warning about unseen dangers, the cargoes that kill, the codes that hide them, and the sea that buries their secrets. To this day, older mariners in the South China Sea still speak of her. They say that on certain calm nights, when radio interference is strong and the stars are sharp, static sometimes carries an old Morse pattern: faint, broken, familiar. All officers, including the captain, are dead. I die. Most dismiss it as atmospheric distortion, but no one listens too long. Perhaps the Orang Medan never existed. Perhaps she was a parable for the age of weapons and secrets, a reflection of humanity's fear of what it could create but not control. But if she did exist, her story is not about ghosts or monsters. It's about the invisible forces that stalk every sea: pressure, gas, error, silence. It's about how quickly progress can become peril. The Orang Medan may be gone, but her message remains clear, a warning wrapped in static.
Some things are better left unshipped, unspoken, and unknown. Next, we move to a story that began with triumph and ended in madness. A royal ship so cursed that kings feared its name, and every crewman who sailed it met an untimely end. In every age of empires, there is a moment when pride sails too far, when ambition builds faster than wisdom can follow. For 17th century Sweden, that moment came on a calm August afternoon in 1628, when the nation's greatest warship, the Vasa, left her harbor for the first time. She was magnificent, a floating fortress of power and art, meant to announce Sweden's arrival as a naval superpower. She also sailed less than a mile before she capsized and sank before the eyes of her king, her people, and her destiny. It was a disaster so complete, so absurd, that it seemed cursed. But the curse wasn't superstition. It was mathematics, politics, and pride.
In the early 1600s, Sweden was rising fast. King Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, dreamed of dominating the Baltic Sea. At war with Poland and eyeing the riches of Northern Europe, he needed a fleet that would inspire awe and fear. His navy already had capable ships, but he wanted something greater, something that would outshine every vessel afloat. In 1625, he ordered a new class of warship, heavily armed, richly decorated, and symbolically supreme. That ship would become the Vasa, named after the royal family itself, a symbol of divine power. She was designed by Dutch master shipbuilder Henrik Hybertsen, a man renowned for his craftsmanship, but aging and ill. Hybertsen had built ships before, but none like this. The king demanded that Vasa carry 64 bronze cannons, far more than any previous vessel of her size. He wanted her taller, heavier, and more ornate than all rivals. And he wanted her fast. The combination was impossible, but no one dared say so. Construction began in 1626 at the Stockholm shipyard. The hull stretched nearly 70 meters, 226 feet, enormous for its day. Her bow rose like a cathedral wall, adorned with hundreds of sculptures painted in gold and red. There were lions, angels, emperors, and gods, each carved to glorify Sweden's power and intimidate its enemies. The shipwrights worked tirelessly, but the king's demands kept changing. He sent orders from the battlefield, insisting the ship be made larger, her decks higher, her guns heavier. Hybertsen protested. He needed to test her stability first, but Gustavus Adolphus refused delay. He wanted Vasa ready for war that year. By the time she neared completion, Hybertsen was dead, leaving his assistants to finish a ship whose design they didn't fully understand. Worse still, the shipbuilders had no access to modern measurements. They built by feel, experience, and the king's impossible expectations. The result was magnificent and doomed.
On August 10th, 1628, Stockholm turned out to celebrate the Vasa's maiden voyage. Crowds lined the quays, merchants shut their stalls, and nobles stood on balconies as church bells rang. The ship gleamed in the sunlight, her hull freshly painted, her sails unfurled. King Gustavus was away at war, but his officials were present to witness the triumph. The wind was light, the harbor calm. With drums beating and cannons firing ceremonial salutes, the Vasa slipped from her moorings and began her first journey down the narrow channel. For a few minutes, everything was perfect. The ship moved gracefully, her flag snapping in the breeze, her carved figures glowing like fire. But as the wind shifted, something subtle and deadly began to happen. The Vasa leaned, then leaned again. Water poured in through her open gun ports, the very symbols of her strength. The crew rushed to close them, but it was too late. In less than 15 minutes, the Vasa rolled onto her side, filled with water, and sank 100 meters from shore, in full view of the celebrating crowd. 50 sailors and soldiers drowned. The rest swam for their lives as the pride of the Swedish Empire vanished beneath the surface of its own harbor. The shock was immediate and total. How could such a powerful, modern warship sink in calm weather before even reaching open water? King Gustavus demanded an inquiry. Witnesses testified. Shipwrights were questioned. Mathematicians were summoned to measure stability, a science barely understood at the time. One of the shipbuilders admitted that they had tested her balance before launch by having 30 men run from one side of the deck to the other. After 3 runs, the ship rocked so violently that the test was stopped out of fear she would capsize while still tied to the dock. When asked why they had proceeded anyway, he replied, "The king was impatient. We could not delay his will." The verdict of the inquiry was both simple and evasive. The ship was built as ordered. No one was punished. No one dared suggest that the fault lay not with the builders, but with the monarch himself.
It would take centuries before engineers fully understood why the Vasa failed. Her hull was too narrow for her height. Her center of gravity was far too high because of the heavy upper decks and massive gun batteries. In essence, she was a tower, balanced on a raft. The problem was compounded by uneven construction. The ship's port and starboard sides were not symmetrical. Archaeologists later discovered that measurements used on each side were taken from different units of length: Swedish feet on one side, Amsterdam feet on the other. A difference of only a few centimeters per beam added up to structural imbalance. In modern terms, she was a masterpiece of art and an engineering nightmare. For 333 years, the Vasa slept in darkness beneath Stockholm's harbor mud. The cold, brackish waters of the Baltic preserved her timbers almost perfectly. Occasionally, fishermen snagged their nets on something massive below, but no one imagined it was an entire ship. Then, in 1956, amateur archaeologist Anders Franzen began searching for her wreck. He had spent years studying naval archives and believed she had sunk too close to shore to have broken apart. After months of dragging the harbor with a homemade grappling hook, he struck wood. When divers went down, they found something astonishing: the entire hull of the Vasa, upright, almost intact, her carvings still visible. For the first time since 1628, sunlight touched her deck. Over the next 5 years, engineers built pontoons and cables to raise the ship from the seabed. On April 24, 1961, the Vasa broke the surface, dripping, ghostly, and magnificent. Spectators wept as her black timbers emerged from the water, glistening like oil. It was the most complete 17th century warship ever found. Inside were thousands of artifacts, clothes, coins, weapons, tools, and even human remains. The ship's carvings, once painted in bright reds, blues, and golds, revealed how flamboyant and theatrical she had been, less a weapon of war than a floating declaration of glory. Restoration took decades. Today, she stands preserved in the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, a monument to both human brilliance and folly. Her masts rise through the museum roof, visible from across the city, a silent reminder that even greatness must obey the laws of nature. The Vasa story is often told as a parable of pride, the moment when a king's ambition outweighed physics itself. But it's also a story about fear, the fear of questioning authority. The builders knew she was unstable, the officers knew she was unsafe, but the word of a king was law. No one dared tell him that his ship of state could not stand. So they built her anyway, and the sea delivered the verdict that the courtiers would not.
Today, millions visit the Vasa each year. They walk her decks, Stare at the faces carved into her hull. Greek gods, warriors, lions, angels, all gazing outward as if still guarding a power that no longer exists. The Vasa's timbers have outlived the empire that built her, the men who died aboard, and even the monarchy that ordered her creation. She is not a relic of failure, but a conversation between arrogance and reality, beauty and burden, ambition and gravity. For Sweden, she became more than a cautionary tale. She became a national treasure, proof that even disaster can be reborn as knowledge. The science of naval architecture that grew from her sinking would shape modern shipbuilding for centuries to come. 400 years later, the Vasa still smells faintly of the ocean, salt, oak, and time. In her stillness, she teaches a lesson that every sailor knows and every ruler forgets. The sea does not care who commands. It does not respect crowns, flags, or faith. It listens only to balance. When that balance is lost, between pride and prudence, ambition and humility, the ocean always collects its due. The Vasa didn't sink because of a curse. She sank because truth, ignored, always waits for calm water. Next, we leave the Baltic for a colder, more desolate sea, the Antarctic frontier, where a ship faced the ice not with arrogance, but with endurance, and where every man aboard survived through sheer will. Some ships vanish in fire, others sink in storm, but a few are destroyed by silence, by a world of ice that doesn't move fast, but never stops moving at all. The Endurance was one of those ships. She didn't go down in battle or burn in glory. She froze, was crushed, and disappeared beneath the Antarctic Sea, taking with her one of the greatest survival stories in human history. It is a story of leadership and loyalty, of men who faced the impossible and lived to tell it. And at its heart was one man, Sir Ernest Shackleton, a leader whose failure became a legend greater than victory itself. In the early 1900s, the last blank spot on the map was Antarctica, a continent of mystery, surrounded by seas that devoured ships. For the British Empire, obsessed with exploration, the South Pole was the ultimate prize. By 1911, that prize had already been claimed. Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen reached the pole first, leaving British rival Robert Falcon Scott to die on the return journey. The race to the pole was over. But Ernest Shackleton had another dream, to cross the entire continent from sea to sea through the pole. It would be the final, greatest challenge of exploration. He wrote in his proposal,
"Men go out into the void spaces of the world for various reasons, some for love of adventure, some for scientific inquiry, and some for the desire to reach the unknown. I go because it is in me." The Admiralty approved his plan. Private sponsors donated funds. He named his expedition the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, and the ship he chose to carry it, the Endurance. Her motto was simple and prophetic: "By endurance, we conquer." The Endurance was a Norwegian-built three-masted barkentine, 144 feet long, designed for polar work. Her hull was reinforced with oak, greenheart, and steel, nearly 5 feet thick at her strongest point. She was meant to withstand ice, not to conquer it. Her bow was curved to rise when the floes pressed in, allowing her to ride above the pressure rather than be crushed. No ship was better prepared, or so they believed. Her crew numbered 28 men, sailors, scientists, carpenters, and even a photographer, Frank Hurley, who would capture the most iconic images in the history of exploration. Shackleton himself hand-picked every one, prioritizing humor and resilience over skill. He once rejected a navigator with perfect credentials because he looked too gloomy. The Endurance left Plymouth, England in August 1914, just as the First World War erupted in Europe. King George V personally allowed Shackleton to proceed, saying, "Go on, the country will need heroes when you return." They sailed into history. By January 1915, the Endurance had reached the Weddell Sea, one of the most treacherous bodies of water on Earth. There are no tides there, only ice. Endless ice. Sheets of it stretching for hundreds of miles, shifting, groaning, and colliding like slow thunder. For weeks, the crew forced the ship forward through leads, narrow openings in the pack ice. Then, on January 18th, the sea closed around them. The ship was trapped. At first, they waited, confident the thaw would free them by spring. They read, played cards, trained sled dogs. But the ice was alive. It wasn't waiting. It was crushing. Day by day, the pressure increased. The hull creaked, timbers groaned, and seams split. By October 1915, the ship began to buckle. Shackleton wrote in his journal, "The ship groaned, shuddered, and twisted as if in agony. I felt her dying beneath me." On October 27th, he gave the order, "Abandon ship."
The men set up camp on the frozen surface, dragging supplies, dogs, and lifeboats onto the floe. Behind them, the Endurance slowly tilted, her masts leaning like crosses against the gray sky. On November 21, she gave one final shudder and sank. They were now 800 miles from the nearest human settlement, stranded on drifting ice with no radio and no hope of rescue. And yet Shackleton refused despair. He gathered his men and said simply, "Ship and stores have gone, but our hearts and hopes remain. We will go home." For months, the crew drifted with the ice, camping on floes that cracked and refroze beneath their feet. Temperatures plunged below minus 30 degrees Celsius. They hunted seals and penguins to survive. Their sled dogs grew weak. Eventually, they were shot to preserve food. Morale faltered, but Shackleton's leadership held them together. He refused pessimism, enforced routine, and shared hardship equally. When one sailor complained, Shackleton swapped tents with him. When morale sank, he ordered the cook to make hot milk for everyone. By April 1916, the ice began to break apart. They launched the lifeboats, 3 small open vessels, the James C. Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. For 6 days, they battled freezing waves until they reached a barren speck of rock called Elephant Island. It was land, but not salvation. No one had ever landed there before. No one would ever come there by chance. Shackleton realized that their only hope lay in sailing one of the lifeboats across 800 miles of open ocean to the whaling stations on South Georgia Island, through some of the roughest seas on Earth. He chose 5 men and the sturdiest boat, the James C. Caird, reinforced with planks and canvas. On April 24, 1916, they set out, leaving the rest behind with the promise, "Hold on, I'll come back for you." For 16 days, they battled storms, frostbite, and exhaustion. Their sextant readings were almost impossible amid the waves, yet navigator Frank Worsley managed to keep them on course, missing South Georgia by less than 10 miles over 800. When they finally reached land, the men were too weak to stand. They had crossed the world's most dangerous ocean in a rowboat. But the ordeal wasn't over. They had landed on the uninhabited side of the island. The whaling stations were on the far side, separated by glaciers and peaks no one had ever crossed. Shackleton, Worsley, and seaman Tom Crean set off on foot with only a 50-foot rope and a carpenter's adze. For 36 hours,
They climbed over ridges, slid down ice slopes, and marched through the night without rest. At dawn, they heard the distant whistle of a whaling station. Human life. When they stumbled into the station, bearded, frostbitten, and filthy, the Norwegians stared in disbelief. They had been presumed dead for over a year. Shackleton's first words were simple. "My name is Shackleton." After resting briefly, Shackleton organized a rescue. 4 attempts were made, all turned back by sea ice. Finally, on August 30, 1916, aboard the Chilean vessel Yelcho, he reached Elephant Island. As the fog lifted, the men saw his ship approaching. All 22 survivors staggered to the shore, shouting and waving. Shackleton counted them, one by one. Every man was alive. The Endurance expedition failed in its goal, but it succeeded in something far greater. It became a model of survival, leadership, and resilience. Shackleton never lost a man to the cold, hunger, or despair. He kept discipline without cruelty, hope without illusion. Modern psychologists study his expedition as a case of leadership under extreme crisis. He once said, "Difficulties are just things to overcome, after all." He proved it true. For over a century, the Endurance lay undiscovered beneath the Weddell Sea, entombed in ice. Then, in March 2022, a team from the Endurance 22 expedition located her using submersible drones. She was found at a depth of 3,008 meters, upright, intact, her name still visible across the stern. Endurance, carved into history. The photographs shocked the world. The ship looked as if she had been frozen yesterday, her timbers preserved by the Antarctic cold. It was one of the greatest maritime discoveries ever made. The sea had kept her safe, and Shackleton's promise that the story of Endurance would live forever was fulfilled.
The Endurance teaches a truth older than exploration itself, that heroism isn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to yield to it. In a world of steel and empire, Shackleton reminded humanity that leadership is not about conquest, it's about compassion. His voyage wasn't about reaching a goal, but about bringing everyone home. The ice may have taken his ship, but not his soul. The ocean swallowed the wood, not the will. And so long after empires fade and flags sink, the name Endurance still glows, a symbol of what humans can endure when all else is lost. Next, we travel from ice to tropical fire, to a ship whose passengers vanished into the jungle after wrecking on a remote island, giving rise to a tale of survival, mutiny, and a society born from disaster. The sea is not cruel, it is indifferent. But when indifference meets ambition, greed, and fear, it can become something worse than cruelty. It can become Batavia. This is not just a shipwreck story. It's a story of what happens when civilization itself breaks apart, when survivors turn on each other, when paradise becomes a prison, and when the ocean, having devoured the ship, demands the souls that came ashore. The wreck of the Batavia is one of the darkest episodes in maritime history, a tragedy that stripped away every illusion about courage, faith, and human decency on the high seas. In 1628, the Dutch East India Company, the most powerful trading organization in the world, launched its newest flagship, the Batavia. She was massive for her time, 150 feet long, carrying 340 people and cargo worth a fortune: gold, silver, silk, jewels, and chests of coin destined for the company's Asian outposts. She represented the might of the Dutch Golden Age, an empire built not by conquest alone, but by commerce. Her destination was Java, the center of Dutch operations in the East Indies. Her journey, if successful, would take 8 months across half the globe, from Amsterdam down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and through the treacherous Indian Ocean to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. Her commander was Francisco Pelsart, a seasoned company official known for discipline and loyalty. Her skipper was Arian Jacobs, a brilliant but volatile sailor who despised authority. And among her crew was a man who would turn this voyage into horror: Hieronymus Cornelis, a failed apothecary, brilliant, charming, and quietly insane.
From the beginning, the Batavia was troubled. Jacobson and Pelsart detested each other. Their rivalry infected the crew, dividing loyalties. And Cornelis, outwardly polite, inwardly venomous, played both sides, whispering, manipulating, and spreading rumor. He had boarded the ship, fleeing disgrace. His business in Holland had failed. His reputation was ruined. But on the Batavia, he saw opportunity. He befriended Jacobson, exploited his hatred for Pelsart, and began quietly plotting mutiny. The plan was simple. Once they reached the Indian Ocean, they would seize the ship, kill the officers loyal to Pelsart, and sail to a new life as pirates. There was only one problem: the ocean itself. On June 4th, 1629, after 8 long months at sea, the Batavia struck a submerged coral reef off the coast of Western Australia, part of the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands, a maze of sharp coral and barren rock. The impact was catastrophic. The ship's hull split open, seawater rushed in. At first, the survivors were calm. Pelsart ordered lifeboats lowered and supplies salvaged. But the reef offered no real island, just flat coral and small sandbanks. There was no fresh water, no trees, no shelter. Only sun, salt, and despair. Pelsart took a longboat with Jacobson and a few sailors to search for water on the mainland. But after days of failure, they decided to make for Java, more than 1,800 miles away, to seek rescue. Against all odds, they made it. But by the time help returned, salvation had become slaughter. Back on the reef, the survivors were left in chaos. There was no leader, no food, and no law. That's when Hieronymus Cornelis stepped forward. Soft-spoken, eloquent, and persuasive, he declared himself acting commander in Pelsart's absence. He promised order and salvation, and at first he provided it, rationing food, organizing guards, and offering hope. But Cornelis had no intention of saving anyone but himself. He knew Pelsart would eventually return with the Dutch fleet, and when he did, the mutineers' earlier plot would be exposed. So he decided to erase the witnesses.
Cornelius gathered a small band of loyal followers, men who shared his hunger for power and freedom. Then, slowly, methodically, he began the murders. It started with the sick and the weak. Those who couldn't work were sent to other islands under the pretense of searching for supplies. In reality, they were drowned. Next, Cornelius ordered the execution of anyone who opposed him: officers, sailors, even women and children. He set up a system of terror, dividing the survivors into factions and turning them against each other. Within weeks, more than 120 people were dead. The sand ran red, and the gulls feasted. Those who remained alive were either killers, slaves, or those too terrified to resist. Cornelius wore silks taken from the cargo hold and surrounded himself with armed guards. He lived as a king among corpses. But not all the survivors submitted. A small group of soldiers, led by Wibbe Hayes, had been sent by Cornelius to a nearby island, supposedly to die of thirst. Instead, they found a spring of fresh water and birds to eat. When news of the murders reached them, they fortified their island with stones and sharpened stakes. Cornelius realized he had an enemy. He sent raiding parties to crush them, but the soldiers, fighting with improvised weapons, repelled every attack. The barren reef became a battlefield between tyranny and survival. At last, Cornelius himself led an assault, but Hayes's men captured him alive. For the first time, the tyrant faced judgment. Still, the killings did not end. Cornelius's followers continued fighting, desperate to maintain control. In September 1629, nearly 3 months after the wreck, sails appeared on the horizon. Pelsart had returned, aboard the Sardam, with armed soldiers from Java. When he came ashore, Hayes's men met him, shouting the tale of what had happened. The commander listened in disbelief as he walked among bones and burned camps. The once disciplined company fleet had turned into hell. Pelsart's response was swift and merciless. He convened an immediate tribunal on the beach. Cornelius and his lieutenants were tried, found guilty, and executed on the spot.
Cornelius's hands were cut off before he was hanged, a symbolic punishment for the hands that had ruled through murder. Others were taken back to Java for trial. In the end, 125 people were dead out of 341, not from the sea, but from each other. The Batavia disaster shocked Europe. For the Dutch East India Company, it was a scandal, proof that greed and power, unchecked by law, could destroy not only ships, but souls. For philosophers and theologians, it became a grim parable. What happens when men are stripped of civilization and left with only will and fear? The Batavia story spread through journals and sermons. It wasn't just a maritime warning, it was a mirror. Centuries later, historians would call it Australia's first European settlement, a colony born not from exploration, but from murder. For more than 3 centuries, the Batavia lay buried beneath sand and coral, her treasures scattered. Then, in 1963, divers off the coast of Western Australia discovered the wreck, remarkably preserved. Bronze cannons, gold coins, and personal belongings lay strewn across the seabed. Many artifacts were recovered, including parts of the ship itself, now displayed in the Western Australian Maritime Museum in Fremantle. The reconstructed hull stands there today, dark, massive, and solemn, surrounded by the names of those who perished. It is not presented as a monument of adventure, but as a memorial to cruelty and survival. Every wreck tells us something about the sea. The Batavia tells us something about humanity. The ocean did not kill these people. They killed each other. In the absence of law, one man's ambition became another man's doom. Jeronimus Cornelius believed that the world had abandoned him, that on a desolate reef he could create his own kingdom. But the sea does not grant kingdoms. It only loans time. When the waves finally returned, they washed away his empire of sand. Archaeologists still find bones on the islands, buried in shallow graves, some showing signs of violence, others of desperate starvation. Each discovery renews the same question:
What happens to morality when survival is all that remains? For sailors, the story of the Batavia became a warning. No matter how far from land you are, civilization must be carried within you, or the ocean will strip it away. The sea tests ships. Isolation tests souls. And few have failed that test as completely as those stranded on that reef in 1629. The Batavia story is one of fire, blood, and sand. But next, we turn to ice once more. To a ship that didn't die in mutiny, but in mystery. Swallowed by fog, rediscovered in perfect condition, and said to sail still beneath the aurora.
There are ships that sink, and there are ships that are found. And then there are those that return when they should not exist at all. The Octavius belongs to that last kind. A vessel said to have vanished into the Arctic only to reappear more than a decade later, adrift, silent, and filled with the frozen dead. It's one of the most chilling maritime mysteries ever told, a story that blends history, rumor, and the eternal human fascination with the edge of the world. Whether the Octavius truly existed or not, her legend endures because it feels true. A ship undone not by mutiny or storm, but by the arrogance of believing that man could master the ice. The 18th century was an era of exploration, of maps, of courage, and of ignorance disguised as discovery. European empires, driven by greed and science alike, were obsessed with finding faster routes to Asia. The Arctic, with its shifting glaciers and mirages of open water, seemed to whisper promises of fortune, a northwest passage, a direct trade route between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Many had tried and died seeking it. Still, in 1761, a British merchant vessel called the Octavius supposedly left London bound for China. She carried 28 men, fine goods, and her captain's family, his wife, and their young son. She made the voyage east successfully, arriving at Canton in 1762. But on the return journey, the captain made a fatal decision. Instead of taking the long, safe route around the Cape of Good Hope, he would attempt to return through the Arctic to become the first to traverse the Northwest Passage from west to east. He would never be seen alive again. The Octavius set sail from Canton in late 1762. Her logs show that she passed Alaska and entered the Chukchi Sea the following summer. Then, silence. No message, no wreck, no survivor. She simply disappeared. In the decades that followed, ships continued to vanish in the Arctic, explorers like Franklin, Ross, and Hudson, but the Octavius would outdo them all in mystery. Because unlike the others, she came back. According to maritime accounts, on October 11, 1775, the whaling ship Herald was sailing off the west coast of Greenland when the lookout spotted a distant ship drifting amid ice floes. It was half buried in frost, her sails torn, her masts splintered, but her hull intact. She flew no colors. The Herald's captain, Warren, ordered a small team to investigate. They rowed across the still, frozen sea and climbed aboard. What they found was death, but not the kind they had ever seen before.
The decks of the Octavius were covered in snow. Frost clung to every railing like crystal lace. But there were no signs of violence or storm damage. The hatches were sealed, the rigging frozen in place. Below deck, in the great cabin, they found the captain sitting at his desk, his logbook open, a pen still in his hand. He was frozen solid, as if caught mid-thought,
staring at something beyond the walls of his cabin. Beside him was the body of a woman wrapped in blankets and a young boy clutching a doll. The temperature had preserved them perfectly, their features ghostly but intact. The boarding party fled the cabin in terror, but before they left, one man, the ship's mate, grabbed the logbook from the desk. The final entry was dated November 11th, 1762. The coordinates placed the ship somewhere north of Alaska, in waters no ship had ever crossed. If true, it meant the Octavius had succeeded where all others had failed. She had completed the Northwest Passage, only to die within sight of home. For 13 years she had drifted, locked in the Arctic ice, carrying her frozen crew through a voyage they never finished. The story spread quickly, first among sailors, then across the British press. The details shifted from teller to teller, but the core remained the same. A ghost ship found off Greenland, her crew frozen, her captain's pen still poised above his log. Historians have searched for evidence ever since, but no official record of the Herald's logbook exists, and no Octavius appears in Royal Navy or East India Company archives. So, was it real? The truth is complex. One, a fiction based on fact. There were indeed numerous merchant vessels lost in the Arctic during the 18th century. Some, like the Globe and Hopewell, were found years later, intact and icebound, their crews frozen at their posts. It's entirely possible that the Octavius story began as one of these real discoveries, exaggerated, merged, and retold until legend replaced name. 2. The perfect tale. Others argue that the Octavius was invented whole by sailors or journalists, a moral parable about hubris. In an era when Arctic exploration was deadly and national pride was high, the story of a captain who dared to challenge nature and lost made an irresistible warning. 3. The Northwest Passage connection. The Octavius legend predates Franklin's doomed expedition by almost 70 years, but both share eerie similarities: overconfidence, entrapment, and the haunting image of men frozen in time. When Franklin's ships, Erebus and Terror, were finally found in the 21st century, many saw in their discovery a reflection of the Octavius myth, as if legend had foretold reality.
Whether true or not, the image of the Octavius's captain has outlived the facts. He sits forever at his desk, surrounded by the dead, trapped between success and annihilation. In that frozen stillness, he represents every explorer who believed the world could be conquered by courage alone. The sea rewards courage, but the ice rewards humility. Even if the Octavius was invented, the emotions it evokes are very real. For sailors of the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of being trapped in ice, conscious, helpless, slowly freezing, was more terrifying than any storm. It was the slow death of movement, the betrayal of the very element they trusted most. Modern oceanographers and polar historians point out that a wooden ship could indeed drift intact for years in Arctic ice. The low temperatures, lack of oxygen, and absence of wood-eating bacteria could preserve both ship and bodies for decades. When Franklin's Erebus was raised, the men's remains were still astonishingly well preserved: hair, nails, even skin. It's not impossible, then, that something like the Octavius really happened. A ship trapped by ice, freed years later, and mistaken for a ghost. What is certain is that the Arctic still swallows ships without trace. Satellites even today lose track of vessels caught in shifting flows.
The Octavius may have been one of the first to vanish into that white labyrinth, and the first to return as a story instead of a wreck. The Octavius is more than a tale of maritime horror. It's a mirror of the Enlightenment, the age when mankind believed reason could explain everything, even the sea. It reminds us that exploration is not just a conquest of the unknown, but a confrontation with it. Every ship that enters the Arctic risks becoming a ghost ship, even today. The ice does not destroy quickly. It erases slowly, beautifully, like memory fading under frost. And perhaps that's why the Octavius endures, not as fact, but as warning. That there are still places where the world does not care who we are or what flag we fly. The Herald's crew, it said, tried to tow the Octavius out of the ice, but failed. The weather worsened, and they were forced to abandon her. When the fog lifted, she was gone. Some claim to see her again years later drifting north, still trapped in her frozen circle. Others swore she appears to this day near Greenland, under the northern lights. A ghost ship still completing the route she died to prove. The Octavius is gone from the world, but not from imagination. And perhaps that is fitting. After all, she is not a ship of wood and sail anymore. She is a ship of story and silence, forever sailing the thin ice between myth and truth. Next we move from frozen legend to living flame, a ship whose disappearance changed the course of technology itself, and whose end was heard, not seen, in a single desperate radio call.
Some tragedies come from nature, some from pride. But the ones that echo through history, the ones that change the world, are born of arrogance and war. When the RMS Lusitania slipped beneath the waters of the North Atlantic on May 7, 1915, she carried more than passengers and mail. She carried the illusions of safety in a civilized age. Her destruction was not just the end of a voyage, it was the end of innocence. One torpedo, 18 minutes, and the world would never see the ocean, or war, the same way again. In the early 1900s, the oceans were the arteries of empire. Britain's power rested on its merchant fleet, its liners, and the illusion that British ships ruled not only commerce, but civility. Yet by 1906, that supremacy was being challenged. Germany had launched a new generation of liners, fast, luxurious, and modern, the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, Deutschland, and Kronprinz Wilhelm. They weren't just ships, they were floating embassies of industrial might. To answer this challenge, the British government turned to the Cunard Line, offering subsidies and naval protection in exchange for 2 record-breaking ships. Thus were born the Lusitania and her sister ship, the Mauretania, marvels of Edwardian engineering, built to symbolize Britain's technological supremacy. When she was launched in 1906, the Lusitania was the largest moving object ever created by human hands. 787 feet long, displacing over 31,000 tons, powered by revolutionary turbine engines producing 68,000 horsepower, she could cross the Atlantic in under 5 days. Her interiors rivaled royal palaces, sweeping marble staircases, gilt lounges, chandeliers, and Persian carpets. Passengers described her as an Edwardian city at sea. To sail aboard her was to feel untouchable. But the world was changing faster than the engines that drove her. When World War I broke out in August 1914, the oceans became battlefields. The British Royal Navy imposed a blockade on Germany, strangling its trade. In response, Germany unleashed its new weapon, the U-boat, a submarine capable of sinking merchant ships unseen. At first, the German Navy promised to spare civilian vessels, but by 1915, desperation and retaliation hardened policy. Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone, warning that any ship, armed or not, might be attacked. The Lusitania continued to sail regardless. She carried mail, passengers, and, though the British denied it, war materials. The Admiralty quietly armed her and instructed her captains to evade submarines through speed and course changes. To the public, she remained a passenger liner. To the Germans, she was a legitimate target.
On May 1st, 1915, the Lusitania departed New York Harbor, bound for Liverpool, with 1,959 souls aboard, 1,257 passengers, and 702 crew. Among them were families, businessmen, artists, and 128 Americans. As she departed, newspapers in New York carried a chilling notice from the German embassy. Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and Great Britain, and that vessels flying the flag of Great Britain are liable to destruction. Most dismissed it as propaganda. Captain William Thomas Turner, a veteran mariner, reassured passengers that the Lusitania's speed made her safe. She could outrun any U-boat. He was wrong. Lurking off the coast of Ireland was U-20, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Walter Schwieger. At 1:20 p.m. on May 7th, Schwieger sighted smoke on the horizon. Through his periscope, he saw a four-funnel liner, unmistakable. He knew instantly what it was. The Lusitania was unescorted, traveling at a reduced speed due to fog, just 11 miles off the Irish coast. She was in range. At 2:10 p.m., Schwieger fired a single torpedo. 30 seconds later, it struck the starboard bow, just beneath the bridge. A dull thud. Then, moments later, a massive second explosion ripped through the hull, far greater than any torpedo could cause. Inside, chaos. The lights flickered, the ship shuddered, and within seconds, she began to list sharply to starboard. Passengers were thrown off their feet, crockery shattered, children screamed. The torpedo had hit below the waterline, but the second explosion, likely caused by ammunition or coal dust, destroyed the watertight compartments. The Lusitania began to sink almost immediately. Lifeboats became death traps. The tilt of the ship made it nearly impossible to launch them properly. Those on the high side dangled uselessly above the deck. Those on the low side smashed against the hull as they hit the water. Turner stayed on the bridge, refusing to abandon ship. He tried to steer her toward shore, but the engines were dead. At 2:28 p.m., just 18 minutes after the torpedo struck, the Lusitania rolled and vanished beneath the waves. 1,198 people died. Only 761 survived. The sea was littered with wreckage, lifebelts, furniture, and the dead. The survivors were picked up by small fishing boats and local vessels from the Irish coast. Among the dead were artists, mothers, infants, and more than 100 American citizens.
News of the sinking spread across the globe within hours. The reaction was immediate and furious. Britain denounced the attack as barbaric. Germany defended it, insisting the ship had been carrying arms. And indeed, later dives to the wreck confirmed munitions in her hold. But to the world, the nuance didn't matter. A passenger liner had been sunk without warning. Women and children had drowned. Public outrage, especially in the United States, was immense. President Woodrow Wilson, still clinging to neutrality, protested to Berlin, quote, "No warning that an unlawful and inhumane act will be committed can make that act lawful." Germany, unwilling to risk drawing America into the war, temporarily suspended unrestricted submarine warfare. But the damage was done. When the policy resumed in 1917, it became the final straw that brought the United States into World War I. The torpedo that sank the Lusitania also sank isolationism. To this day, the nature of the Lusitania's second blast remains debated. Schweiger reported hearing a second, heavier detonation immediately after impact, one that tore through the ship far beyond what a single warhead could inflict. Theories abound. Munitions. The ship carried 173 tons of rifle cartridges and 50 cases of shrapnel shells, legal under international law, but deadly when ignited. Coal dust. Fine coal particles in the bunkers may have exploded after the torpedo's impact. Steam lines. The pressure of ruptured boilers could have magnified the damage. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. A vessel once hailed as unsinkable, destroyed in less than 20 minutes. The Lusitania lies today off the coast of Ireland, 300 feet below the surface, her hull twisted and broken. Divers who have reached her describe a landscape of corrosion and memory. Dining chairs lying beside rifles. Porcelain teacups scattered among live shells. For decades, the British government classified her cargo, reluctant to admit she carried war materials aboard a civilian liner. Even now, her holds remain unstable, potentially containing unexploded ordnance. But time has softened even steel. The sea has claimed her completely, a silent tomb where luxury met mortality.
Among the survivors was the ship's captain, William Turner, rescued unconscious and near death. He was blamed by the Admiralty for failing to follow zigzag evasive orders, though he had received no clear warning of U-boats in the area. The guilt haunted him until his death. Others were less fortunate. Entire families were wiped out. Famous names, art dealer Theodate Pope, author Elbert Hubbard, and millionaire Alfred Vanderbilt, perished alongside steerage passengers whose names never reached print. Newspapers around the world printed lists of the dead for weeks. The age of the gentleman's war was over. The sinking of the Lusitania reshaped both maritime law and public consciousness. Passenger liners would never again be seen as neutral zones. The boundary between civilian and combatant at sea had blurred forever. It also taught governments a new kind of power: propaganda. Britain used the event masterfully to sway global opinion, framing the war as a moral crusade rather than a political struggle. Posters depicted drowning mothers and children beneath the words, "Enlist, remember the Lusitania." And Americans remembered. 2 years later, when German U-boats resumed unrestricted warfare, those memories ignited the call to arms. The cry for vengeance was not for trenches or empires. It was for a ship and the lives taken aboard her. The Lusitania's death marked the end of the Edwardian dream, the belief that luxury and technology could insulate humanity from violence. Her passengers had dressed for dinner as the world slid toward apocalypse. Her chandeliers sank beside telegrams of war and love. In one instant, she transformed from a floating palace to a symbol of everything civilization could lose. In the cold dark off the coast of Kinsale, her rusted hull still rests, a cathedral of steel, silence, and consequence. A reminder that even beauty can become a weapon, and even comfort can become a coffin. The Lusitania's legacy is not just her sinking, but the world she changed, the moment when war came for the innocent, and the sea became its messenger. Next, we travel backward again to an older ship, one that carried dreams of freedom instead of passengers of luxury, but whose decks became a graveyard for hope. a ship whose story changed the course of human rights forever.
The sea has always been a graveyard, but some graves are not carved by storms or war. They are carved by choice. And among all the choices ever made upon the water, none is darker, colder, or more haunting than what happened aboard the slave ship Zong in 1781. It was an atrocity not born from rage nor desperation, but from calculation, a decision made in the language of profit. The Zong didn't just drown hundreds of enslaved Africans, it drowned whatever was left of humanity in those who commanded her. Yet out of that horror came something unexpected, a spark that ignited one of history's greatest moral revolutions. The sea, once silent witness to cruelty, would become the mirror in which the world saw itself. In the late 18th century, Britain was at the height of its power. The empire's wealth flowed from colonies across the Atlantic, and at the center of that wealth was the slave trade. British ships carried goods from Europe to Africa, exchanged them for men, women, and children, and then transported their human cargo across the Atlantic to the plantations of the Caribbean. It was called the Middle Passage, and it was hell itself. The Zong was a Dutch-built ship captured and refitted by British traders. In August 1781, she left Accra on the Gold Coast of Africa, modern-day Ghana, bound for Jamaica. On board were 442 enslaved Africans, chained, starved, and packed into spaces so tight they could neither sit nor stand fully upright. The captain was Luke Collingwood, a man once trained as a surgeon. He was about to commit a crime so vile that it would echo for centuries. The voyage was chaotic from the start. The ship was overcrowded, the crew inexperienced, and navigation poor. After weeks at sea, the Zong's water supplies began to run low. Collingwood, confused and possibly delirious, believed they had missed Jamaica entirely and were lost in open ocean. In reality, they were within sight of the Caribbean islands, just a few days' sail from safety. But Collingwood didn't know that, and in his panic, he made a decision that turned desperation into atrocity. In the laws of maritime insurance, enslaved people were not considered human beings. They were classified as cargo, insured property, like sugar, rum, or cattle. If cargo was lost due to spoilage or illness, it could not be claimed. But if it was jettisoned to save the ship, the owners could demand compensation.
That meant that if slaves died of disease, the company lost money. But if they were thrown overboard, it could be claimed as a necessary sacrifice. Collingwood gathered his officers. Together, they agreed that the only way to save the ship and the voyage's profits was to throw part of the cargo into the sea. Not the barrels, not the rum, the people. On the night of November 29, 1781, the first group was brought on deck. 54 men, women, and children. Their chains were struck off only so they could be hurled more easily into the dark water below. The screams carried across the waves as the ocean swallowed them whole. The next day, 42 more were thrown overboard. Over the following nights, another 36 were drowned. When a group of captives managed to break free and leap into the sea on their own, Collingwood recorded the loss as suicide. By the time it ended, over 130 human beings had been murdered, all so that an insurance company could pay for them. The rest of the captives, sick, starving, and traumatized, finally reached Jamaica weeks later. By then, 62 more had died from disease and neglect. When the Zong returned to Britain, the ship's owners, Gregson and Co. of Liverpool, filed an insurance claim for their lost cargo. The underwriters refused to pay, calling the act deliberate murder. So the owners took them to court. In 1783, the case of Gregson versus Gilbert was brought before Lord Chief Justice Mansfield in London, the same judge who just a decade earlier had ruled that slavery had no standing under English common law. But this was not a murder trial. It was an insurance dispute. The enslaved men and women were not represented as victims. They were the subject of property damage. The court records called them goods and chattels. The lawyers debated not whether lives were taken, but whether the killings were necessary. The ship owners argued that the deaths were a commercial decision. The insurers countered that it was an act of negligence. No one called it what it was: mass murder.
But one man in the gallery could not remain silent. Granville Sharp, a British abolitionist and humanitarian, was appalled by what he heard. He had long campaigned against slavery, but the Zong case crystallized his outrage into purpose. He wrote to newspapers, petitioned Parliament, and demanded that the case be treated as homicide. Though the criminal courts refused to reopen it, his campaign exposed the brutality of the slave trade to the public for the first time. Sharp's activism inspired others, including Olaudah Equiano, a freed African who had survived the Middle Passage himself. Equiano's published narrative, combined with the Zong outrage, awakened Britain's conscience. For the first time, ordinary citizens began to ask, what kind of nation profits from drowning the innocent? In the years that followed, the Zong massacre became a rallying cry for the abolition movement. Artists, poets, and preachers invoked it as a symbol of moral rot beneath imperial wealth. The case transformed the fight against slavery from a political debate into a human one. The poet William Cowper wrote, "We have no slaves at home, then why abroad? And they themselves once ferried o'er the wave that carries freedom to the mind of man." By 1807, Britain passed the abolition of the slave trade, ending the legal traffic of human beings across its empire. By 1833, slavery itself was outlawed in British colonies. And though the sea never gave back the bodies of those lost from the Zong, their memory became part of that tide of change. In 2007, historians confirmed the approximate coordinates of the Zong's wreck, near the coast of Jamaica, though no remains have ever been found. The seafloor there is a calm expanse of silt and coral, disturbed only by fish and current. Yet divers who have visited the area report an eerie silence, as if the water itself holds breath. The Atlantic has always been a cemetery for the enslaved. Historians estimate that over 2 million Africans died during the Middle Passage. Their bodies rest unseen, forming what scholar Christina Sharp called the oceanic grave of modernity. The Zong was just one ship among thousands, but it is remembered because it forced the world to see the ocean not as a route of commerce, but as a crime scene.
Today, Zong is commemorated not with monuments of stone, but with art, song, and remembrance. In Britain, poets like M. Nurbise Philip have reimagined the trial transcripts into haunting verse, giving voice to those who had none. In Jamaica, the sea near where the ship went down is now recognized as a sacred site. The name Zong no longer stands for the ship itself, but for the turning of a tide, from profit to justice, from silence to speech, from the language of ownership to the language of humanity. Every ocean carries the memory of those lost to it. But in the Atlantic, between Africa and the Americas, the water runs deeper with meaning. It carries history's most painful paradox, that civilization's wealth was built on barbarity.
The song reminds us that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the calm waves, disguised as law, as business, as order. And yet, out of that quiet horror came the birth of conscience. The sea buried 130 souls that November night, but it also uncovered something greater, the idea that no life can ever again be treated as cargo. Next, we return to the realm of war and steel, to a ship's death lit the sky and signaled the dawn of the new kind of conflict, where the sea itself became a battlefield of machines. Some ships are built for glory, others for war, but only a few are built for both. The HMS Hood was one of them. She was the pride of the Royal Navy, the symbol of British power between the wars, the very embodiment of an empire that believed itself unshakable. She was also the moment that belief shattered. When she went down in flames on May 24, 1941, in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, she took with her more than 1,400 men. She took the illusion of invincibility. Her death, swift and catastrophic, marked not only the end of an era of battleships, but the beginning of a new age of naval warfare, where speed and technology would rule over size and steel.
The First World War had left the world scarred and uncertain. Navies had changed forever. The dreadnought, once the ultimate weapon, had given way to new strategies, new machines, and new enemies. But in 1916, as the war still raged, Britain began building a ship that would restore its supremacy. The HMS Hood was laid down at the John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland. At 860 feet long and displacing 48,000 tons when fully loaded, she was the largest warship afloat. Longer than any cathedral, heavier than any train, faster than anything her size had ever been. She was designed as a battle cruiser, a hybrid between a battleship and a cruiser, trading some armor for speed. Her designers believed she could outrun anything she couldn't outgun. It was a beautiful, deadly compromise. The ship carried 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly a ton each over 20 miles. Her engines produced over 144,000 horsepower, propelling her at 31 knots, astonishing for a vessel of her size. To the public, she was simply the mighty Hood. When she was launched in 1918, the Great War had just ended, and the world was weary of blood. For years afterward, the Hood served not in battle, but in diplomacy, the Royal Navy's floating ambassador. She circled the globe in 1923-24 on the Empire cruise, visiting ports from Sydney to Cape Town to Vancouver. Everywhere she went, crowds lined the docks to see her, the steel symbol of an empire that ruled the waves. To see the Hood was to see Britain's heart made metal. Schoolchildren learned her name. Sailors spoke of her with reverence. She was not just a warship. She was a promise that Britain would never again be caught unprepared. But beneath her majesty was a quiet, growing truth. The world had moved on. Her armor was thin compared to newer designs. Her deck plating, meant to repel shells from other ships, could not withstand the steep, plunging trajectories of modern naval artillery or the bombs of aircraft. And by the 1930s, she was aging fast. When World War II erupted in 1939, HMS Hood was no longer the newest or most advanced ship in the fleet, but she was still the most famous. She led the home fleet, patrolling the North Atlantic, hunting German surface raiders, and projecting power across the sea. By 1941, the war had entered its darkest stage. France had fallen, Britain stood alone, and German U-boats choked the Atlantic supply lines. Then, intelligence arrived that changed everything. The German battleship Bismarck, the most powerful warship ever built, had set sail from Norway with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Their mission, to break into the Atlantic and destroy Allied convoys. The Royal Navy mobilized immediately. Admiral Sir John Tovey ordered every available ship to hunt the Bismarck down. At the center of this task force was the HMS Hood, under the command of Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, accompanied by the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales. It was a meeting of generations, the old Queen and the young Prince. On May 23, 1941, reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait, the icy passage between Greenland and Iceland. Holland ordered the Hood and Prince of Wales north to intercept. The sea was calm, the air cold, visibility low. At dawn on May 24th, radar contact was made. Two dark shapes appeared on the horizon, the Bismarck and her escort, Prince Eugen. The British ships closed in fast, their crews at battle stations. Every man aboard knew what this meant. The Hood had never lost a fight, and they did not intend to start now. At 5:52 a.m., the Hood opened fire at a range of 25,000 yards. Her first salvos roared through the mist, the recoil shuddering through her massive frame. The Prince of Wales joined seconds later. The Bismarck and Prince Eugen returned fire. The German ships had newer rangefinders, better optics, and shells designed to pierce armor at steep angles. At 6 a.m., a German shell struck the Hood. It hit her amidships, slicing through her weak deck armor and penetrating into her aft magazines, the chambers that stored her massive shells and gunpowder. There was a blinding flash. Then, in a single instant, the ship was gone. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the Hood out of the water. Witnesses aboard the Prince of Wales saw a column of fire rise hundreds of feet into the air. The blast split the ship in two. She sank in less than 3 minutes. Out of a crew of 1,418, only 3 men survived. One of them, Midshipman William Dundas, later recalled, "The ship gave one tremendous lurch and went over. I was flung clear. I remember swimming and looking back, and she was gone. All that was left was the sea on fire." Admiral Holland went down with his flagship. The pride of the Royal Navy, the symbol of an empire, was erased from existence before the enemy could fire a second time.
When news of the Hood's loss reached London, the reaction was disbelief. For decades, she had been invincible, the embodiment of British might. Now, in the span of minutes, she was gone. Winston Churchill received the telegram at breakfast. He read it twice, then stood and said, grimly, "The Bismarck must be destroyed." The loss of the Hood was not just military, it was psychological. To the British people, still enduring the Blitz, it felt as if the heart of the nation had been ripped out. But grief turned to fury. The Royal Navy unleashed everything it had in pursuit of the Bismarck. 3 days later, on May 27, 1941, British forces cornered her in the Atlantic. After hours of relentless bombardment, the Bismarck was sunk, sent to the bottom in fire and smoke. The Hood had been avenged, but at a terrible cost. For decades, the Hood lay undisturbed at the bottom of the Denmark Strait, a myth as much as a memory. Then, in 2001, an expedition led by David Mearns located her wreck using deep-sea submersibles. What they found confirmed what survivors had described. The ship had broken in two, her bow and stern separated by nearly half a mile. The midsection was obliterated, vaporized by the explosion. Her guns still pointed forward as if firing in defiance at the moment she died. A brass plaque was placed near the wreck. In remembrance of 1,415 officers and men who died in the sinking of HMS Hood, may they rest in peace. The Hood's destruction marked a turning point in naval warfare. Her death proved that even the most powerful battleship could be destroyed by a single lucky strike, that speed and armor were no longer guarantees. In the years that followed, aircraft carriers, submarines, and missiles would redefine combat at sea. The age of the great battleship, the floating fortress of empire, was over. But in the hearts of those who remember, the Hood remains more than a relic. She was courage, elegance, and tragedy, all welded into steel. Her loss became the measure of duty itself, the willingness to stand, even when defeat is certain.
Today, the Hood lives on in museums, in the memories of families who still keep her photos, and in the Royal Navy's unspoken creed of resilience. Every ship launched since carries a little of her spirit, that sense of pride tempered by humility before the sea. In the end, the Hood was not just sunk by the Bismarck, she was sunk by time, by the relentless march of progress and the ocean's unforgiving logic. But her story endures because she represents something eternal. The courage to face the horizon, knowing it can end in fire. Next, we descend from the steel and gunfire of the modern age to a quieter, more haunting story. A ship lost not in battle or storm, but in silence. A luxury liner that vanished without a distress call, leaving only an empty vessel drifting on calm seas and a question that still chills sailors today. There are few phrases in maritime lore more haunting than ghost ship. The words conjure images of empty decks and silent sails, and a vessel adrift between the worlds of the living and the dead. But behind every legend, there is a truth, and behind this one, a mystery that endures to this day. The Mary Celeste did not sink in battle or storm. She did not burn, nor was she looted by pirates. She was found perfectly seaworthy with her cargo untouched, her crew vanished, and her purpose forever lost to speculation. Her story is not about death at sea, it's about disappearance, and in that silence lies her power. The Mary Celeste was launched in 1861 from the shipyards of Nova Scotia under the name Amazon. She was a modest-sized brigantine, 103 feet long, 282 gross tons, sturdy, swift, and built for Atlantic trade. Her early career, however, was cursed from the start. Within her first year at sea, she collided with another ship in the English Channel, killing her captain. She changed hands several times, ran aground, and was sold to American owners in 1868, who renamed her Mary Celeste, a hopeful attempt to give the ship a new identity and a clean slate. But the ocean has a long memory. In November 1872, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor, bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying a cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. She was captained by Benjamin Spooner Briggs, a respected sailor with 18 years of experience and a reputation for honesty and discipline. A devout Christian, Briggs had decided to bring his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia on the voyage, a rare choice, but one he saw as safe. His 7-man crew were seasoned seamen, all personally chosen by him. Before departing, Briggs wrote to his mother, "Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a pleasant passage." It would be his final letter. The Mary Celeste set sail on November 7, 1872, and was last sighted near the Azores, a string of volcanic islands in the mid-Atlantic, on November 25th. Then she disappeared.
10 days later, on December 5, 1872, another ship, the British brig Dea Gratia, spotted a vessel drifting erratically some 400 miles east of the Azores.
Her sails were tattered, her motion sluggish, as if she were being guided by an invisible hand. Captain David Morehouse, who happened to be a friend of Briggs, signaled the unknown ship. There was no reply. The crew of the Dei Gratia boarded her. What they found has baffled the world ever since. The ship was completely intact. There was no sign of struggle, no damage, and no fire. The cargo was untouched. The personal belongings of the crew remained in their cabins, including the captain's logbook, clothing, navigation instruments, and even a sewing machine still threaded with cotton. There was food and water for 6 months. The lifeboat, however, was missing, and every soul on board had vanished. The last entry in the ship's log was dated November 25, 1872, 9 days before the discovery. It recorded routine weather conditions and a position near the Azores. There was no hint of danger, no farewell message. The ship's sails were partly set, some torn. The main hatch was open, the compass destroyed, and one of the ship's pumps had been dismantled. In the hold, 9 barrels of alcohol had leaked, leaving a strong, acrid odor. These were clues, but they led nowhere. Everything was in order except for the people. The mystery of the Mary Celeste has inspired hundreds of explanations, from the scientific to the supernatural. Each offers a piece of truth, and each falls short. 1. Mutiny or murder. Some early investigators suspected foul play, that Briggs's crew had mutinied, murdered the captain, and fled in the lifeboat. But there was no blood, no damage, and no sign of violence. The ship's valuable cargo and personal items were untouched. Even the captain's navigation instruments remained. 2. Piracy. Pirates were a common fear in the Atlantic, but again, the evidence contradicted it. No valuables were stolen, and the ship showed no battle damage.
3. Alcohol explosion. The most plausible theory is that fumes from the leaking alcohol barrels built up in the hold, leading Briggs to fear an imminent explosion. He may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily, tethering it to the ship with a rope, but a sudden gust of wind or rough sea could have snapped the line, leaving them adrift. The Mary Celeste then continued on, empty but unharmed. 4. Seaquake or waterspout. Some suggest a sudden seaquake or waterspout frightened the crew, causing them to abandon ship. Yet the Mary Celeste showed no damage consistent with either. 5. Paranormal explanations. Later generations, enamored by mystery, invoked sea monsters, alien abductions, or even the Bermuda Triangle, though the ship was far from that region. These theories, while sensational, say more about human imagination than maritime history. When the Mary Celeste was towed to Gibraltar, the British authorities launched a formal investigation, led by Frederick Sully Flood, the local Attorney General. He was convinced a crime had been committed. He accused Captain Morehouse and his crew of the Dei Gratia of staging the rescue, claiming they had found the Mary Celeste, murdered her crew, and fabricated the ghost story to claim salvage rights. But there was no proof, no bodies, no witnesses, and no motive. After 3 months of inquiry, the court ruled in favor of Morehouse, though it awarded him a smaller salvage payment than usual, a reflection of lingering suspicion. The case was closed, but the mystery remained. If the Mary Celeste had died that day, her story might have ended as a footnote, but the ship herself lived on, and the curse seemed to follow her. She was refitted and returned to service, but every voyage brought disaster. Captains fell ill, crews deserted, and cargoes were lost. In 1885, her final owner deliberately wrecked her off the coast of Haiti in an insurance fraud scheme. She sank at last, her hull breaking apart on the reef, as if the ocean were reclaiming what it had long ago decided to keep. The Mary Celeste became a legend not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Writers like Arthur Conan Doyle fictionalized her tale in the 1880s, turning fact into folklore. The image of an empty ship gliding silently through the mist, tables set, tea still warm, burned itself into popular imagination. But the truth, as always, is quieter. The Mary Celeste was not haunted. She was human. A story of fear, misjudgment, and the fragility of reason when faced with the vast, indifferent sea. The Atlantic can strip away everything but mystery. And sometimes, mystery is the only thing left afloat.
Today, the Mary Celeste endures as the archetype of the ghost ship, a symbol of the sea's power to erase, to preserve, and to confuse. Her name appears in naval training manuals, literature, and even psychological studies of uncertainty and risk. She reminds us that absence can be more haunting than death. In maritime museums, a model of the Mary Celeste sits under glass, her tiny lifeboat missing, a detail left intentionally incomplete. Visitors linger over it, drawn not by tragedy, but by curiosity. We can imagine what it felt like, the air thick with alcohol fumes, the captain's voice tight with concern, the small boat rocking beside the hull, a decision made to wait, just for a few minutes, until the danger passed. But the rope snaps, the wind shifts, and the Mary Celeste drifts away, empty, eternal. The Mary Celeste's story endures not because of what happened on that voyage, but because it asks the oldest question of all. How much of what we lose at sea is gone, and how much is simply beyond our understanding? Ships vanish, crews disappear, and yet, somehow, their stories float forever. The Mary Celeste sails still, not through the Atlantic, but through time, reminding us that the sea is not cruel nor kind, it is only patient. Next, we turn from mystery to myth, from the calm Atlantic to the roaring Southern Ocean, where one of the most famous ghost ships of all time still sails in the minds of mariners. A ship cursed to roam forever, unable to make port, her captain condemned to chase eternity. Some ships are remembered for their voyages, others for their wrecks, but one ship was never found because she never stopped sailing. Across centuries, from Cape Horn to the Cape of Good Hope, sailors have sworn they've seen her, a ghostly silhouette with tattered sails, glowing faintly in the mist, moving against the wind. They call her the Flying Dutchman, a ship doomed to wander the oceans forever, her captain cursed for his defiance, her crew condemned to sail until Judgment Day. For centuries, the story of the Flying Dutchman has haunted sailors, poets, and composers alike, from real-life sightings logged by naval officers to the mythic retellings that transformed her from maritime mystery to symbol of eternal punishment. But where did this legend come from, and was there ever a real ship behind it?
To understand the legend, one must understand the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost tip of Africa, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans collide. For centuries, it was known by another name among sailors, the Cape of Storms. It was here the tempests rose without warning, where waves could swallow a ship whole, and where compasses spun without reason. In the 1600s, Dutch merchant ships, sleek, square-rigged vessels of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, made the perilous journey from Europe to Asia, carrying spices, silk, and porcelain. The route around the Cape was their greatest challenge. Hundreds of ships were lost there, their wrecks scattered along the African coast like bones of forgotten empires. Among them, legend says, was one commanded by a man named Captain Hendrik van der Decken, the Dutchman who dared to defy the sea itself. The story begins in 1641, as van der Decken's ship,
often called the Vlissingen or Hollander in old texts, set sail from Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, bound for Amsterdam. The cargo hold was full, the crew weary, and the journey home long. As they approached the Cape of Good Hope, the winds turned violent. Waves towered above the masts. Lightning illuminated the black sky. The crew begged the captain to turn back or seek shelter. But Van der Decken refused. He was determined to round the Cape, no matter the cost. According to the oldest versions of the legend, he shouted into the storm, "I will round this cape even if I must sail until doomsday." At that moment, the wind tore the sails, the ship rolled, and the sea swallowed her whole. From that night on, the Flying Dutchman was damned, condemned to sail the oceans for eternity, never able to reach port, her captain's defiance echoing forever in the wind. The earliest written reference to the Flying Dutchman comes from George Barrington's A Voyage to Botany Bay, 1795, in which he described sailors in the South Atlantic who spoke of the phantom ship that appears in storms. Soon after, reports multiplied. In 1823, British naval officer Captain Owen wrote of a mysterious vessel that approached us with all sails set, yet against the wind, and vanished as if dissolved. The most famous sighting came from July 11, 1881, when the Flying Dutchman was seen by the crew of the HMS Bacchante off the coast of Australia. Among the witnesses was a young midshipman, Prince George of Wales, the future King George V. His log recorded, "At 4 a.m. the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. A strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, spars, and sails stood out. The lookout man fell dead from the foretop mast." No one could explain what they'd seen, but in every report the details were the same. A spectral ship, glowing in mist, sailing against the wind, vanishing without sound.
In most tellings, the Flying Dutchman is not merely a ghost ship. She is a punishment. Van der Decken's sin was pride, his refusal to bow to nature or to God. His defiance became his doom. According to one version, when the storm struck, an angel appeared and condemned him. "You shall drift forever between life and death until mercy redeems you." Some say the captain begged for forgiveness. Others say he still laughs into the wind, daring heaven to break him. The crew, pale, hollow-eyed, and skeletal, are said to hoist the sails endlessly, patching torn canvas that never holds. Their only contact with the living world comes when they hail passing ships, begging for deliverance or trying to send letters home, letters dated centuries old, addressed to people long dead. To see the Flying Dutchman, sailors believed, was an omen of disaster, a warning that death was near. Beneath the myth lies a foundation of truth, a convergence of maritime science, folklore, and psychology. 1. Atmospheric mirages. In certain conditions, light refracts over the sea, creating what's known as a fata morgana, a superior mirage that can make distant ships appear ghostly, suspended above the water or sailing upside down. These optical illusions are common in polar and subtropical regions, especially near the Cape. To a sailor in 17th century fog, such visions could seem supernatural. 2. The Dutch reputation. During the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company dominated world trade. Their ships were frequent travelers of the Cape route, and many perished in storms. A Dutch ghost ship might have been the imaginative merging of dozens of such tragedies. 3. The morality tale. The story's persistence owes much to its moral weight. In an age of religious fervor and maritime danger, the Flying Dutchman became a parable about hubris, man's defiance of the divine order. To curse a captain for challenging God was not mere superstition. It was theology rendered in salt and wind.
By the 19th century, the Flying Dutchman had sailed from sailors' tales into the realm of literature and art. Writers like Sir Walter Scott Washington Irving and Captain Frederick Marryat immortalized her in print. But the legend reached its fullest form in Richard Wagner's 1843 opera Der Fliegende Holländer, The Flying Dutchman. In Wagner's version, the story became not just a curse, but a tragedy of redemption. The captain, the Dutchman, can be freed only by the love of a faithful woman willing to die for him. Each 7 years he may come ashore to seek her. When he fails, he returns to the sea. The opera transformed a ghost story into an existential one, a meditation on guilt, damnation, and the human desire for forgiveness. It was no longer about sailors or storms, but about the soul. Even into the 20th and 21st centuries, reports of the Flying Dutchman have persisted. During both World Wars, naval officers described strange vessels appearing on radar, only to vanish. In 1939, hundreds of beachgoers near Cape Town reportedly saw a ship sailing into Table Bay against the wind, and then fading into nothing. Skeptics blame temperature inversions, atmospheric reflection, or mirages. Believers say the Dutchman still sails, bound by his captain's oath. Either way, the legend refuses to die, like the ship itself. What makes the Flying Dutchman timeless is not fear, but recognition. He is every sailor who's challenged the storm, every human who's refused to bend. He represents the eternal struggle between defiance and submission, between the mortal and the infinite. To see his ship in the fog is to glimpse one's own pride reflected in the sea. The knowledge that no man, no empire, no vessel can outrun consequence forever. For the Dutchman's curse is not that he sails endlessly, it's that he sails with no destination left. Perhaps the truest haunting of all is not supernatural, but historical. Between the 1600s and 1800s, thousands of sailors perished on the Cape route. Ships like the Haarlem, Stavenis, and Vergul de Drac met their ends there, their crews' names lost to the ocean. Their bones lie beneath coral and sand, but their memory, their endless struggle against storm and greed, lives on in the myth of the Dutchman. He is the embodiment of them all, every captain who swore he would make it home and never did.
The Flying Dutchman endures because he embodies the most human of traits, the refusal to surrender. His story warns us, but it also seduces us. We all want to believe we can command our own fate, that we can master the seas of life by will alone. But the ocean teaches otherwise. It is not a place of control. It is a place of truth. And truth, like the tide, does not yield. Even now, sailors say that in storms off the Cape, when lightning dances across the horizon and the wind screams through the rigging, a shape sometimes appears. A tall ship with ghostly sails, moving steadily into the gale. And though science offers explanations, there's always that moment, that breathless silence between thunder and wave when the rational world falters. When a sailor sees something impossible and whispers, trembling, "The Dutchman sails tonight." Next, we arrive at the final chapter, the conclusion of this odyssey through history's most haunted waters. A voyage not of curses or greed, but of destiny itself, the story of the ship that went farther than any before her, carrying the hopes of a new age and vanishing into legend. The sea has always tested men, but only the Arctic tests their souls. There where the sun vanishes from months and the ice closes like stone,
Ships do not merely sink, they vanish into myth. And none are more mythic, more tragic, or more haunting than the Franklin expedition. A voyage meant to complete the map of the world, but which instead became one of the greatest mysteries in the history of exploration.
2 ships set out in confidence. They would return as ghosts beneath the ice. In the mid-19th century, the British Empire ruled half the planet. But for all its power, there was one frontier it had not conquered: the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic archipelago of Canada. For centuries, explorers had sought it: Cabot, Frobisher, Davis, Hudson, and Perry, and each had failed. By 1845, the Royal Navy believed it had the technology and experience to finish what history had begun. The man chosen to lead was Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old veteran of exploration revered for courage and endurance. He had served in the Napoleonic Wars, commanded earlier Arctic expeditions, and even survived near starvation in the Canadian wilderness. He was called the man who ate his boots, a survivor of everything but time. To the Admiralty, Franklin was a hero. To the ice, he was just another offering.
The expedition's vessels, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were no ordinary ships. They had served as bomb vessels in earlier wars and had recently been refitted with cutting-edge technology. Steam engines gave them power when wind failed. Reinforced hulls allowed them to crush through ice. They carried 3 years' worth of provisions, including over 30 tons of preserved food, libraries of books, and fine china for the officers. The ship's cabins were heated with coal-fired stoves, their decks strengthened with iron, and their hulls lined with sheets of copper to resist ice abrasion. No expedition had ever been so well equipped, nor so doomed. Aboard were 129 men, officers and sailors, many veterans of the Royal Navy. They sang as they left England, cheered on by crowds lining the docks. They would sail into immortality, but not in the way they imagined. The Erebus and Terror sailed from Greenhithe, England, on May 19, 1845. They stopped briefly in Greenland, where local whalers and explorers last saw them anchored in Baffin Bay on July 26th. Then they disappeared into Lancaster Sound, the entrance to the Northwest Passage. No further messages, no distress signals, no survivors ever returned. When 2 winters passed with no word, Britain grew anxious. By 1848, rescue expeditions were launched. Over the next decade, more than 40 search missions scoured the Arctic, funded by the Admiralty, private donors, and Franklin's devoted wife, Lady Jane Franklin, whose relentless campaigning turned her husband into a martyr and legend. What they found were fragments, traces of life, and whispers of death. In 1859, explorer Francis Leopold McClintock found the first undeniable evidence of the expedition's fate. On bleak King William Island, in the Canadian Arctic, his team discovered a small stone cairn containing a message in a metal cylinder. The note read, "HM ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in 1847-7. Sir John Franklin commanding. All well." But at the bottom, written later in a different hand, another message added, April 25, 1848. HM ships Terror and Erebus deserted 5 leagues north-northwest of this. Sir John Franklin died June 11, 1847. The total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. F.R.M. Crozier, captain and senior officer. It was the first and last written record of the crew.
After Franklin's death, Captain Francis Crozier had taken command and ordered the survivors to abandon their trapped ships and march south toward the Canadian mainland. None would make it.
Along the island's western shores, searchers found eerie scenes frozen in time. Skeletons lying beside overturned boats, tattered uniforms still bearing naval insignia, silver spoons engraved with officers' initials, and, most chillingly, human bones showing marks of cutting and scraping, evidence of cannibalism. The revelation horrified Victorian England. The British Empire had long prided itself on discipline and civilization, and yet here were its finest men reduced to the most primal act of survival. For decades, the Admiralty denied the reports, but Inuit oral histories, passed down for generations, told the same story. White men starving on the ice, dragging boats, collapsing one by one, resorting to unthinkable measures. The truth could no longer be buried. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, new expeditions continued to uncover relics of Franklin's men. In the 1980s, forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Beatty led a groundbreaking investigation on Beechey Island, where the expedition had wintered in 1845 to 46. There, 3 graves were found, perfectly preserved in permafrost. The bodies, those of sailors John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell, were astonishingly intact. Their faces looked as though they had died yesterday. Autopsies revealed shocking evidence: high levels of lead in their bones and tissues. The source was traced to the expedition's canned provisions, hastily sealed with lead solder during mass production. The men, slowly poisoned by their own food, likely suffered hallucinations, weakness, and madness. The cold preserved their flesh, but not their fate. For over 160 years, the final resting places of the Erebus and Terror remained one of the Arctic's greatest mysteries. Then, in 2014, Canadian researchers from the Parks Canada team made a historic discovery. Using sonar and underwater drones, they found the wreck of HMS Erebus in the shallow waters of Queen Maud Gulf. 2 years later, in 2016, they located the HMS Terror, astonishingly well preserved, resting upright on the sea floor. Inside, furniture stood undisturbed. Cabin drawers were still closed. Even glass windows remained intact, as if the crew had just stepped out. The Arctic, it seemed, had frozen the past in time.
The discoveries confirmed much and revealed more. Both ships had been abandoned, but later reboarded, evidence that some survivors tried to return. The Terror's intact condition suggests she sank gently, likely while still trapped in ice, sealing her secrets beneath. Among the relics recovered were boots, journals, dishes, and even preserved food tins. Archaeologists continue to explore the wrecks every summer, carefully extracting artifacts that speak of ordinary life turned extraordinary by death. Each item, a spoon, a uniform button, a prayer book, tells a story of endurance, hope, and slow despair. In the years after the loss, Franklin's name became both legend and lesson. Victorians called him a martyr of discovery, the man who gave his life to science and empire. His widow, Lady Jane, spent the rest of her life defending his reputation, funding searches, and ensuring he was remembered as a hero, not a failure. Statues of Franklin were erected across Britain, bearing the inscription, "They forged the last link with their lives." But later generations have seen this story differently, not as triumph, but as tragedy. The expedition was a masterpiece of technology and hubris, undone by its own confidence.
Franklin and his men sailed into the Arctic believing they could tame it. The Arctic proved them wrong. The Franklin expedition endures because it captures the paradox of exploration itself, the balance between courage and arrogance, knowledge and ignorance. It was a collision between an empire's ambition and nature's indifference. In the end, the men of the Erebus and Terror did not discover the Northwest Passage, but in death they helped others do so. Their maps, notes, and remains charted the routes future explorers would take. Their loss illuminated the path forward. They failed, yet they fulfilled. Today, as climate change melts the Arctic faster than ever before, the ghosts of Franklin's ships are emerging from their frozen tombs. The same sea that took them now reveals them piece by piece. Scientists have found fragments of cloth, human DNA, and even boots still imprinted with their owners' footprints. In every thawed artifact lies the same haunting truth: the Arctic never forgets. The Erebus and Terror remain under the protection of the Inuit people, whose oral histories guided modern explorers to their resting places, proving that memory can outlast even the coldest centuries.
The Franklin expedition was meant to close a map. Instead, it opened a story that has never ended. In every generation since, explorers have followed their path, not for conquest, but for understanding. The lesson of Franklin's lost ships is not how men died, but why they ventured at all. Because even in failure, there is discovery. Even in loss, there is light. The Erebus and Terror remain beneath the Arctic ice, but their story sails on, a final testament to the oldest truth of the sea. The ocean keeps everything, but it gives back only what we are ready to understand.